rogue operative, Peruvian cocaine, the CIA, Shining Path, and Iranian intelligence. Forward, the politics of truth. There are many different perspectives on the nature of truth and what precisely and exactly constitutes truth. A significant number of people believe that truth is mutable, changeable, and flexible depending upon the situation and context in which the facts are gathered. For them, truth is a matter of personal perspective and depends heavily upon the culture, organization, and individual psychology of who is doing the evaluation of truth. The other camp believes that there is one objective truth, and we can only approximate truth by putting together the pieces of the evidence left behind. A smaller group of people, who should not go unmentioned, believe that truth does not exist. Thus, reality is ultimately dependent upon the eye of the beholder. This is what I believe. I do not believe in one grand ultimate truth and would best classify myself as an agnostic skeptic who, in his heart and gut, realizes how very little he understands about the universe. I do not claim to be an expert in reality by any stretch of the imagination, as I have very serious issues with documenting what I see and what I hear. In full disclosure and transparency, I have been professionally diagnosed with 2 mental illnesses since 1999. The first is delusional schizophrenia. The second illness is bipolar type 2 mood disorder. I take medications for both illnesses and am currently seeing a psychiatrist for medication management. For the schizophrenia, I take Prolixent, which is a time-released injectable antipsychotic. For the bipolar disorder, I am on a mood stabilizer and antidepressant because I suffer from chronic depression. To be clear, I have a bona fide health disability, but am forced to continue working full-time in order to maintain health care and afford a costly divorce with children. I recognize that I have these mental illnesses and am therefore medication compliant to ensure that I meet the minimum standards for being functional so that I can continue working. So, you see, my account of my involvement with America's secret police in Latin America must be consumed through that lens and filter. Additionally, you should know that the CIA has stopped talking to me for some reason. Though I am no longer in the loop on current secret information in politics, all I can offer you is a personal historical perspective. I contend that this personal historical perspective is somewhat accurate in that I am a trained historian with a PhD in communication studies. However, for the past 10 years, I have been actively delusional with my logic and thinking, and I recognize my inherent limitations. As you can see, I have 0 issues whatsoever about being publicly honest. I will tell you the cold, hard facts as I came to know and experience them firsthand, and I will give you accounts and details and examples to build the context from which you can make your own judgment. You can call me crazy. You can call me a whack job. You can call me completely out of my mind. I've heard it all before. But I've been certified by 3 different psychiatrists with the same illnesses. So I'm fairly certain that I suffer from these psychological and psychiatric disabilities. But I'm not going to let that stop me from telling what I believe and conclude to be the truth. As all of you know, the CIA has a habit of denying things. That's why they're called the CIA. If information leaks into the press that they have been involved with something, they will always deny it. Even if they didn't do it, they will still deny it. So, dearest audience, I am certain that I can tell you with 100% full accuracy and confidence that this account, my account, is not a CIA authorized account. If you ask the CIA whether these facts are accurate, I'm positive and certain and sure that you will get an official denial. However, I have a very direct message for the CIA. Denying the truth does not change the facts. And according to my story, I was a first-hand witness to the events that occurred in my life. And I am a firm believer that the very best thing about telling the absolute truth is that you don't have to try to remember what you actually said in the first place. If you tell the truth, consistency is always your ally. And I have always believed that it is much better to be slapped and kicked and punched and beaten with the truth than kissed with a lie. So, if you don't believe me, that's fine. And you can draw any conclusion from this work that you choose to draw. For that matter, you can easily classify this as an entertaining piece of fiction if you don't want to draw any conclusions from my rendering of the past or eyewitness accounts. However, I contend that this is not a fictional piece. I contend that the facts that I recount for you, the audience, are accurate. I believe that I was at the nexus of a very large conspiracy context and have reason to believe that I'm still being monitored by the CIA. After having developed a very interpersonal relationship with the agency over the years, I'm certain that my electronic devices and communications are still being monitored to determine if there is any further political activity on my part. However, I press on. Move forward. Albert Einstein once said, "Whoever is careless with the truth in small matters cannot be trusted with important matters." The CIA, also known as the agency, was very careless with my personal truth and reality, which is why I am motivated to take my story public. Upon being tapped to be a CIA covert operative in Latin America, my entire life got upended, and I found myself disconnected from the United States as a political dissident. When I was in my doctoral program at the Florida State University for communication, my major professor and mentor, Marilyn J. Young, always used to say that truth passes through 3 stages. First, truth is ridiculed publicly. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it becomes accepted as being self-evident and obvious. Perhaps the things that I have to say in this book will go through a similar process through these 3 stages and become commonly accepted as an understood truth throughout the world. I'll tell you what. Now that you know that I am sometimes delusional without medication management, you believe whatever you want to believe. All I'm going to do is serve out what I believe to be the truth, wrapped in humble pie. You can accept it. You can reject it. You can accept some of it. You can reject some of it. Or you can stop listening and put this book down and go about your business without even considering what I have to say. How's that for you? There's a part of me that still contends that I do not have these psychiatric and psychological issues. However, for the sake of my loved ones and for the sake of everyone else around me, I take the medication prescribed regularly to make sure that I'm compliant with doctor's orders. So, if I do have these illnesses, I want to make sure that I'm taking the proper medication for the management of my resulting symptoms. But after listening to this book, you will undoubtedly realize that the things I have gone through are enough to tear down the most resistant psyche. In other words, I've been through some real serious shit. And while this was going on, I was going through a divorce with children, which cost about $327,000 in total. That's United States American dollars. Alimony, child support, division of assets, legal fees, a Chapter 13 bankruptcy, not to mention the emotional scars of separating from my ex-wife and children, significant organizational and political pressure at work, constant committals into psychiatric wards, and the police regularly visiting my house at least once a month just to see how things were going. I was suicidal at points, not just sad, but genuinely suicidal, where I wanted to blow my head off with a gun or slice my wrists. I was on the edge. You just get to a point where you think you are completely worthless to anyone anymore, and all you want to do is die. I've been there. I know what it's like to have a .357 Magnum revolver stuck in your mouth. I know rock bottom. We're old friends. So you see, your writer, your author, has some issues. If my life was a movie, it would be a mix between Forrest Gump and Fight Club, as written by Charles Bukowski and directed by Ron Howard. I have mental issues, financial issues, relationship issues, work issues, sexuality issues, parental issues, child issues, financial issues, paranoia issues, you name it. And here I am spilling the beans publicly and maybe even proudly. Accordingly, while I did my postdoc at Oxford and have a PhD from Florida State University and am a Department of State senior specialist for the Fulbright Foundation, there can be some very legitimate arguments made about my personal and professional credibility. There's a lot that I simply just plainly do not understand and do not recognize about the construction of the universe and the politics therein. Anyway, the personal account that I'm going to give you is much like trying to look at the world through a kaleidoscope. This book is not a CIA thriller. It is a distorted psychological account of my life as it intersected through the CIA recruiting and onboarding process. As well, it is also an account of one scholar's fractured perspective on being in communication daily with the agency for about 8 to 9 months. And without any debriefing, communication ceased in 2009, and the agency began becoming aggressive with me. One last observation I would like to make about the truth. As we all know, the truth hurts. Sometimes it's painful, and it definitely takes no prisoners. Faithfully, I will tell you the truth as I experienced it and as I recall it. There may be some misperceptions along the way. You may have cause for concern at one point or another. And after experiencing the totality and wholeness of this book, you may have very little respect for me as a person, or for that matter, as a human being. But I shall continue to speak my truth, building an audience around the world of like-minded individuals who understand that when you cross borders, you are not merely researched by security forces. You are digitally interrogated and scanned by a massive computerized surveillance structure at every juncture and checkpoint. The world's security systems are now collaborating with data to each other. And everyone that passes through an immigration checkpoint now goes through a very deep and thorough research and investigation process. But maybe you don't want to hear about that right now. This book is about one man's journey through life, how he handled puberty, how he mastered the art of academics, became a prolific publishing author with 9 books to his belt, got recruited by the CIA, and was an active operative in Latin America, and then was decommissioned with the silent treatment. That's right, the silent treatment. As in, you're on your own from here out, big boy. And what happened next? Bankruptcy, divorce, separation of personal and professional networks, repeated hospitalization in mental wards under court order, illegal and unlawful termination pressure, fitness hearings, and police harassment. And what was my job? What was I supposed to do? Just go about my business, especially about the things that I have seen and the things that I have done, make a living, and resume life as normal. Well, gee, I guess I'm not that strong. Maybe before I finish this book and really stir the pot throughout the world, I should check myself before I wreck myself. Like my dad has always said, sometimes I get constipation of the brain and diarrhea of the mouth. But you know what? You only live once. You only live once. And that's the damned truth. Best case possible, we get 100 years. That's the human cycle. Statistically speaking, in the United States, we're only supposed to live until about 78 years of age. My dad is 83 and my mother is 80, and right now things don't look so good for either of them. Mom has had several strokes over the past year and is completely blind and disabled. My father watches after her around the clock, and he has COPD and emphysema. There's an old phrase that has a lot of wisdom to it. The most dangerous man at the bargaining table is the one with nothing to lose. Professionally and financially, I've reached that point. The only thing left for me in my gut is this story. And I aim to tell it with veracity, precision, and contextual references that any other fellow human being can understand. So, by all means, if you like this book, send it out to all of your friends. Alert your personal and professional networks that there's something interesting online that they can read or listen to that may change their perspective about how things operate. I want you to read all of the words in this book. Listen to all of the audio. Consider my case. Help me get my story into the mainstream global media. Hopefully we can get Oprah's attention. All I have left in the world are my professional degrees and an insatiable need to give power to truth in all that I do. I could easily see this intellectual property, this book, this audiobook, being circulated from friend to friend across borders online, sharing the knowledge and power of information in terms of liberating people from the shackles and chains of psychological servitude. I'm here to make an argument for myself and frankly everyone. Even with all of my deficiencies, I believe I have a voice at the table and should be recognized as an adult and not a child. In many ways, I hope that this audiobook transcends that simple vision, and people around the world begin to take heed to what their governments do, both seen and unseen, both recorded and unrecorded, both reported and unreported. It is high time that the shadows of conspiracy bear witness to a torch. We must circumvent the evil places in the world where international influence and intrigue among espionage forces are common. So I ask you for a favor. Tell your friends about this book. Tell your colleagues about this book. Use this book for classroom instruction. If you are at all concerned whatsoever about the effects of globalization, when you can fly around the world in 12 to 14 hours, and the future of an interdependent globe, circulate this text among your friends and colleagues. Tell them about this product. Pass on my news. Hopefully one day, this book will be translated into Spanish, Italian, Arabic, German, French, Russian, Chinese, and other varieties of popular languages. I hope that this book leaves a large imprint on the world. In fact, if you want to get in touch with me and help me promote this product to your friends worldwide, send an email to tyadams.334@gmail.com. That's tyadams.334@gmail.com, and tell me how you can help me by joining my team. I'm a very friendly person, and I consider myself kind and, believe it or not, extremely rational. I'm especially interested in the social media and online marketing techniques to increase sales and advertising. Obviously, I'm trying to make a buck here because my financial situation has been depleted to zero, but I want to offer you something of value in exchange for your compensation. Ideally, I would just like to post this online on about 1,000 different listservs and let it fly. But I have made a career of writing journal articles, book chapters, editorial pieces, academic treatises, textbooks, and even websites for free. The point of time in my life has come, and I believe it's come for all of us, where I necessitate remuneration for the services that I deliver, because historically, at each and every juncture, I have been shortchanged. So please excuse me for asking for money, but beyond this book, I would really like to start a publishing company for other rogue operatives. You see, this book is not a one-time thing for me. I'm building a brand. It's the Rogue Operative brand. I read recently how J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, once lived in her car for several months and considered suicide daily for several years before she struck it rich with her fictional characters. Frankly, I figure she's a good role model for me, moving into this abstract, unstable, completely unpredictable future. Chapter 1. My birth was an act of war. Hello, dearest reader. How are you doing today? I hope excellent. Please allow me to formally introduce myself to you, if you don't mind for a moment. My name is Ty Adams. I have a PhD in communication studies from the Florida State University in 1995, so some people choose to call me Dr. Ty Adams out of respect. Well, you might be thinking to yourself right now, what in the Sam Hill is this book all about? Good question. Very good question. This book is unique. It is part autobiography, part memoirs, and part expose of the federal government of the United States of America. Over the past decade, I have visited some 22 countries scattered across the globe. I have seen Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand. I have partied in Peru, Colombia, Mexico, and Amsterdam. By the way, if you're wondering, Amsterdam was 3 times. Cambodia was 4. I have worked in Kazakhstan, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Mexico, and also the Bahamas, and currently I am in the United Arab Emirates, located in Dubai. But don't confuse courage from desperation. My path has not always been easy whatsoever. I feel very much like I've been carrying a big mountain on my shoulders, and my legs have grown tired of carrying the enormous burden. It has really been something of an exhausting experience. You see, I have a burning need in my soul, in my mind actually. It wakes me up constantly in the middle of the night like a haunting dream. It's the same feeling I get when I have to take a dump. It's a human urge, a psychological urge, if you will. And it's healthy to remove the waste from a biological organism, they say. I have a confession to make, and I want the world to know. I was a former CIA covert operative in Peru and Mexico, a gig which lasted about 8 to 9 months in total. I met people I never thought I would meet. I did things I never thought I would do. And I was literally bawling it for about a year. The access to money, power, and influence was intoxicating, to say the very least. Oh heavens, I'm spilling the beans way too early. I think I better back up a little bit and put this into the proper historical critical perspective. Methodologically speaking, what you are reading is called an autoethnography. It is the researcher researching his or herself. It's like an autobiography, except for the fact that more attention is paid to the emotions, thoughts, and feelings of the writer about the events and people in his or her life. So to truly understand me and the amazing things that I have experienced, we have to go all the way back to Fort Smith, Arkansas, around 1967-1968. It was at that time that the Arkansas Razorbacks were doing pretty well in football, and the Clintons had not yet emerged onto the scene politically. Frederick Adams and Betty Adams had a son on August 8, 1968 in Fort Smith, Arkansas, which is known as Sebastian County. This child was named Tyrone Adams. Fred and Betty could not have any more children, so they settled on raising Tyrone all by himself. Fred was a sewing goods representative who made a respectable salary for Arkansas and had a bright future ahead of him as a salesman. Before Fred married Betty, he had aspired to the rank of sergeant in the United States Air Force and was predominantly based at Edwards Air Force Base in California. Fred's job was to deliver the film from top secret Air Force projects in the desert to Hollywood for processing at Eastman Kodak Company. Betty was his stay-at-home mother and housekeeper. Everyone was from Southern upbringing, because all the relatives lived in Alabama and Georgia. In a mere 3 years, the Adams clan of 3 would move to Asheville, North Carolina. This is where I would have my first memories as a child. We lived in the mountainous region of the Blue Ridge Parkway. It was both scenic and breathtaking. I remember being scared because of the cliffs alongside the roadway. I remember my cousin Dwight, who had terminal Hodgkin's disease, coming to visit the house. I remember my dad setting fire using gasoline to an anthill that had become overpopulated. I remember vibrating metallic football fields with magnetic players. I had a lot of G.I. Joes, and I think one time, according to my mother, Betty, I took my Tonka trucks to the living room, pulled off my diaper, and started excavating my shit as if it were dirt. Obviously, I was a handful. The die had been cast. The mold had been cut. Tyrone Adams was a cute little monster. After only living for 2 years in Asheville, North Carolina, in 1972, the Adams family would move to Greenville, South Carolina. Not a vast distance, but culturally significant enough to notice. Greenville, South Carolina was known as the Bible Belt of the South. There were more practicing fundamental Christians in this area than you could possibly imagine. However, that didn't stop Fred from drinking his Schlitz beer on the weekends while watching SEC football on television. And this was back during the days when you had to rely on a proper TV antenna to catch a good signal. There was no such thing as digital, and there was no such thing as cable. You were doing pretty good if you got 2 or maybe 3 television stations in total. Luckily for me, we got the LPTV PBS channel on our TV's UHF dial. So I was raised on Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers, and the Electric Company. Occasionally, we would have snow in the winters in South Carolina. It was here that I learned about the superiority of the University of South Carolina over Clemson University. Some might question that fact now, actually, given what's been going on in football. But I've never really had any love for Clemson. My love for the Arkansas Razorbacks and my love for the University of South Carolina Gamecocks is etched in my memory as a youth. I remember more G.I. Joes. I remember the $6 Million Man, Steve Austin, astronaut. I remember Evel Knievel. I remember Spidey comics, which were very easy to read. And most of all, I remember the faithful, loyal, and unnegotiable love that my father and mother had for me. They were hard, but they were fair. They demanded things of me that were beyond my ability and forced me to grow as a human being. They were supportive and kind and always in my corner. They have been for my entire life, and I love them dearly. There's nothing in this world that can replace the loss of a mother or father. Nothing. As I began to speak in coherent sentences, Greenville, South Carolina got a little small for my dad. It was about 1975 when Donahue Sales Company asked my dad if he wanted to relocate to Tampa, Florida. And after a lengthy family discussion with my mother, who clearly wanted to be by the beach, we moved to Oldsmar, Florida in 1976. 1805 Forest Drive, to be specific. By now, I was riding my bicycle without training wheels and in the 3rd grade at Oldsmar Elementary School. Oldsmar is equidistant to both Clearwater and Tampa, snugly placed in the swamp. In the Bay Area, Oldsmar is where the bad kids come from. Countryside, Clearwater, Dunedin, Largo, St. Petersburg, all pretty well-to-do areas. But Back then, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter were the presidents. Oldsmar was just full of trees and snakes and sand scorpions. It was not the ritzy beach. One day, my mother was rushing to get to the store on time because it was about to close. She kept pressuring me to get my clothes on and hurry up. The fact is, I wasn't wearing any underwear. And after I used the restroom to go pee-pee, I zipped up my pants quickly and my wiener got caught in the pant zipper. Of course, I started bleeding. And when I saw blood, panic and hysteria set in, and I started howling uncontrollably. My mother panicked and called the paramedics to the house. In a neighborhood filled with other kids, when an ambulance comes to one of your friends' houses, you turn your bicycle around and head to that house, just to see what's going on. Everyone was standing around outside, waiting to hear what had happened. After all, your health issues are publicly advertised throughout the neighborhood when an ambulance comes screeching to your house. The paramedics had to go up my pants leg and cut across the bottom of the zipper with 10 snips in order to get the zipper to release. At 7 years old, when I saw all of my friends inside the property lines, sitting there with their bicycles trying to find out what had happened to me, I felt pretty sad. But with the innocence of a child, I went outside and told my friends that I had been rescued from my pants zipper. The ordeal was over and everyone could simply go back home. Obviously, I had a lot to learn about neighborhood politics and my own stupidity. Immediately, they all began laughing at me, and I felt the emotion of truly being embarrassed for the first time. I have a habit of speaking what is on my mind without recognizing the consequences or retribution involved. My dad calls it my lack of common sense. Hence, you can call me codename Zippy. If that wasn't enough self-punishment, wait until you get a load of this. In class one day, the teacher told us to make a newspaper with original stories within which contained real-life experiences that we had had. So I constructed a headline that read, "Young man rescued from pants zipper. See story on page 5. The teacher came by my desk while I was working, read the headline, and called the entire class over to look at my project. Everyone read the headline, and yes, they laughed and laughed and laughed at me, and I was humiliated again. But much like this book, I'm telling the raw, cold truth. And even though I am exposing myself to a certain degree, my words will remain true to you. You can call me a nut job. You can call me a wacko. You can say that I'm leaking government secrets. You can say anything you want to say, frankly. I really don't care what you or others think about me, because I have been seasoned throughout my life to deal with scorn, repudiation, and abject ridicule. Harbor Palms in Oldsmar was a rough neighborhood. There was some kind of fist fight at the bus stop before or after school on a daily basis. You either learned how to defend yourself or you got your ass kicked. The choice was yours. It was survival of the fittest because no one escaped the fistfight circle. It was a lot like Fight Club, to say the least. My mother had given me specific instructions never to hit another person. As a result, when I was attacked at the bus stop, I usually curled up in a ball on the ground, taking my punches and kicks from multiple people. It wasn't just me, mind you. It was everyone in the neighborhood. After my mother witnessed the fistfights at the bus stop, she told me very firmly to defend myself. and I asked her how I could possibly do that because I didn't know how to hit anyone. It was August 8th, 1978, and for my birthday, my father bought me and himself a set of boxing gloves. It was then that he put on a wig and 2 glow-in-the-dark plastic eye cups and proclaimed himself Rocky. He told me that he was going to teach me how to fight. And we boxed, and we boxed, and we boxed. Slowly, after much time and much training, my father told me I could go to the bus stop alone without my mother. This time, I knew the basics of boxing. And I kind of realized that my hands could be used as weapons. One day, Mike Liberty ordered Dougie Salerno to kick my ass. Since Dougie didn't want Mike Liberty to kick his ass, Dougie started pushing me and my books to the ground. I tried to get up, and he got on top of me. He was pounding my face over and over and over, so I panicked. Adrenaline shot through my system, and I rolled him over, got on top of him, and started beating the holy hell out of him. Next thing I knew, my mother was pulling me up off of Dougie Salerno. So you see, when I'm backed into a corner and I'm getting the living hell handed to me, at first I'll crawl up into a ball on the ground and take my lumps. But there's a point where I'll snap. Everybody snaps. Everyone has their point of no return, and you can just take so much of an ass kicking before your natural human instincts of survival kick in. And this has been a theme throughout my life. No matter what challenge I faced, it was always against the odds. I was the perpetual underdog, predicted to lose before I even started, in everything that I have done my entire life. Whether it was sports, whether it was academics, playtime, social events, reputations, I have been the outcast, merely because I did what my teachers asked me to do, which was read. And I have read literature, and I have read history, and I have read philosophy. I know the difference between Marxist Russia and Maoist China. I've seen London and I've seen France. The next 4 to 5 years in Oldsmar was filled with a lot of experimentation, the desire to be like Rambo and Bobby Worth, who attacked me one day at the soccer field. Puberty had put Bobby Worth at a distinct advantage over me, so there would be no contest in this fisticuffs match until I snapped. Something told me to get Bobby on his back. Well, you see, my adrenaline kind of burst, and I successfully turned him over and then proceeded to bite a plug out of his stomach. He immediately began howling. But the good news was he was no longer pummeling me to death. I spit the flesh from my teeth, and his brother came over to his assistance. Once again, everyone has their breaking point. It was around this time, I guess, I must have been 13 or 14, when marijuana started becoming introduced to our social circles. I resisted trying it for 2 or 3 years because I thought it would turn me into some sort of zombie, addicted and completely worthless to anyone, even society. But little by little, time after time, I came to appreciate weed in all its varieties and manifestations. We used to grow it in the woods. Like I said, eventually you recognize that the bad kids come from Oldsmar, Florida. We used to build tree forts in the forest, go fishing at the train track trestle, cast nets for mullet. We used to swing on tires in trees, We would shoot BB guns at each other, chew tobacco, smoke cigarettes, drink beer, and pretty much any other hoodlum thing that you can think of doing. Obviously, we called each other names. Everything was screw this or to hell with that. We stole things from the local 7-Eleven. Atari video games were a pastime. And finally, puberty had put me at an advantage in the neighborhood, and I leveraged my power accordingly. Our neighborhood, Harbor Palms, was a very Darwinian environment where you had to rise through the ranks until no one bothered you anymore. We played Dungeons and Dragons with dice and figurines and created characters for battle over what must have seemed like an entire summer. Andrew Kopp was usually the dungeon master. We would smoke weed, drink Mad Dog 2020, and generally try to get a glimpse of Andrew Kopp's sister, Lorraine, washing the car. Oh yeah, I was around 14 or 15 years of age, and Lorraine had some fine legs and a nice ass. It was around this time that I started wrestling for the JV squad at Countryside High School. I loved wrestling. It was a team sport, but it was actually in all reality an individual sport. It was around this time that I started lifting weights regularly. Ronald Reagan was in office. It was the 1980s, and Joan Jett, Bruce Springsteen, and REO Speedwagon ruled the airwaves. Jordache jeans were popular, girls wore leg warmers, and a common hairstyle was known as the feather, parted straight down the middle and brushed back. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone were huge box office hits. Tom Cruise, a noted Scientologist, was frequently in Clearwater, Florida at the Fort Harrison Hotel, which serves as the international headquarters for the Church of Scientology. There are a lot of Scientologists in the Bay Area, for your information. I got pretty good at wrestling. I went 9-2 in my sophomore year and placed third in a statewide tournament held in Orlando. I frequently pinned my opponents, and the yearbook did a story on me for all of my classmates. It was around that time I started becoming popular as a result of sports, and my straight A average started hovering around the 2.0 C area. I was more concerned with beer and women and cars and comic books and joke books and weed and engine repair to really care much about what happened in class. Truth is, I became an arrogant little shit. I thought I knew it all and nobody else was going to tell me right from wrong. Full-scale adolescence had begun. I was no longer a child, but I was not yet a man. The best way to describe me was a man cub. I had my share of girlfriends along the way. One of my girlfriends had an abortion without my knowledge and told me later on in life. We were all crazy, experimenting and experiencing the thrill of being an adult and driving a car. We were young, naive, stupid, and full of ourselves. I would pick fights with unsuspecting teens that were just a little bit younger than me. I would push people around. On occasion, I was a real asshole. Within a week of driving my first car, I totaled out 2 vehicles on the highway. I got caught stealing beer and cigarettes from the grocery store where I worked, frequently had speeding tickets, and was a general menace to society. The wisdom of my mother and father was to give me enough rope to hang myself. I remember when I was 13 and I came home from a friend's house whose parents were having a New Year's Eve party. He and I got drunk on a bottle of champagne, Cold Duck specifically for those of you who are interested. My father had his hands full. My dad wiped my forehead with a wet cloth as I vomited into the toilet and took me to a good Baptist church the very next Sunday. I felt so guilty for having come home drunk at 13. I joined the congregation and got baptized. That's when I started reading the Holy Bible on a regular basis. However, my attention span was not prepared to embrace Christianity for any significant duration of time. I didn't have the focus. I didn't have the understanding, and I definitely didn't have the wisdom. It wasn't long after a couple of years in high school, and by my junior and senior year, I'd morphed back into a complete bastard. The only motivation that I had was that I wanted to kill communists for Ronald Reagan. I was completely and totally against the evil empire of the Soviet Union, and while we're at it, to hell with the Chinese too. I was pro-America, right of center, dead right in fact, and I knew absolutely everything. Liberals were not someone to be tolerated, and you have to remember, liberals are basically communists. However, through all of the psychological, political machinations that I was doing, I was still reading. Comic books, philosophy books, quote books, textbooks. And even though I had a poor academic grade point average, I was always in the gifted classes. I recall one time in our gifted seminar when they played an audio recording of the mass suicide in Jonestown, Guyana, where Jim Jones convinced an entire church to drink and inject their children with cyanide. The sounds of those people howling and dying as the chemicals were eating away at their flesh, turning their organs into puree blood, haunted me in my dreams for a decade. I don't think that was a fair thing to do to someone who was only 16. The sounds were just so gruesome, and it really happened. Sometimes we forget that major calamities and atrocities occur during our modern times. But human psychology is strange, and people do some pretty fucked up things. So I've always been the guy in the classroom that had the answers. I was well read, spent a lot of time with my Encyclopedia Britannica, and my parents bought me an Apple II computer for Christmas in 1983. And I instantly learned basic language programming. This was in the early days, when you had to have a base for your telephone receiver to act as a modem. There was no direct connection or graphics on the dial-in interface. The computers would talk to one another by way of audio signals, and the internet was still just textual. Somehow, probably because of general apathy and stupidity, my grades still suffered, and I started thinking about a career in the military. Once again, we were all addicted to Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone movies. It was about that time that a recruiter with the United States Army contacted me and started telling me about the GI Bill. He suggested there was a quick route to become an officer if I went through ROTC basic training. I was destined to go to Georgia Military College, or maybe even the Citadel. But when I went through basic training, I realized that the military was not for me. So I did not, as a result, attend military college. So there I was, a senior in high school, absolutely, positively one of the dumbest specimens of humanity on the planet with a lot of reading under his belt. I was an emotionally challenged brainiac. I had no direction. I had no clue. I was sexually active. I had several girlfriends at the same time in other cities around the Bay Area. I had big biceps, but a small frontal lobe. And several of my friends claimed to be practicing Satanists. They read the literature of the cult. On the beaches during the weekends, we were constantly recruited by Scientology church members. We were rowdy, we were young, we didn't have a care in the world, and we definitely acted like barbarians. We would smash mailboxes with baseball bats while driving around in our cars. And here I was, about to graduate high school and enter society as a normal, functioning member. Obviously, it was time to grow up a little bit, but you couldn't have told me that. My very first true love, Trina Alt, had a father named Jeff. Jeff Alt was a former Marine that had a very interesting experience on 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. He was both a sniper and a journalist. He often spoke about being in the CIA. To make a long story short, I really started to believe in this man. He became a father figure to me, even though my own father was a little disappointed by this fact. Jeff Alt would frequently recall the moments he and his platoon were under fire during the Tet Offensive. He would show me all of his pictures, his bronze jungle boots, and recall all of the prostitutes that he had had sex with. Meanwhile, Jeff Alt ran a Trucking for Jesus outfit known as Maranatha Moving. Their motto was, "A mover with a heart." In the early days of his relationship with me, he frequently talked philosophy, politics, sociology, psychology, but most of all, God's will that we should all be financially wealthy. I believed him. I believed him wholeheartedly. He was very persuasive and credible and had a very smooth interpersonal style from which to tell his stories. He could get me spellbound for hours talking about radical black ops espionage. It was very appealing for an 18 to 20-year-old young man, and I started to model my life after him. Jeff Alt's moving business flourished because of the long and steady stream of credit that he had secured from a bank for the corporation which managed the moving company. Credit was all the rage among many Republicans during the 80s. They always dined at the Hyatt Regency and would bring me along. They bought 2 Jaguars, fully decked out with all of the options. They traveled internationally to Europe every summer. They bought a yacht and scuba gear and took me out on the boat frequently. They owned several houses, including a condo on St. Petersburg Beach, and eventually the excesses got out of control and Jeff Alt's marriage to Vicky crumbled, the credit ran out, and the moving business could no longer sustain itself underneath its largesse. Basic Reaganomics. And while we still owe a debt of gratitude to Ronald Reagan for expanding the economy in unbelievably paradigmatic ways, we have to remember that it was because he stole funds from Social Security to pour into the general economy. And ever since then, presidents and Congresses have been dipping into the Social Security Trust Fund as if it were their right and privilege to access what should be sacred financial territory. For a 2-year period of time, I moved furniture for Jeff Alt's moving company. My muscles were big and bulging. I was lean, had hair, and started to divert my attention toward business. Luckily for me, I had a pretty good vocabulary and a fair share of reading under my belt, so it was rather easy to regroup. And after being on academic probation at St. Petersburg Junior College in Clearwater for 1 year, I got my act together and proceeded to graduate with an Associate of Arts in General Education. By doing this in the state of Florida, I had qualified to be able to transfer directly into any major university within the state. My grade point average was high enough, and my new career goal of being a lawyer caused me to apply to the University of Florida. Even though I got accepted at Florida State University and the University of South Florida, I decided to go to UF. You see, one of my extracurricular activities, St. Petersburg Junior College, was joining the speech and debate team. I regularly practiced with my professor and peers and learned how to give speeches of all types. informative speeches, persuasive speeches, extemporaneous speeches, impromptu speeches, dramatic interpretation, Lincoln Douglas debate, cross-examination debate, you name it. If it had to do with competitive intellectual activity, I was all about it. The fact that they gave us trophies as rewards for excellent performance during competitive rounds only fed my ego even more. And I had my eye on the University of Florida. When I got my acceptance letter, I knew in my heart that I was going to become a Gator. So Gainesville, Florida, here I come. Chapter 2, Bleeding Orange and Blue. The year was 1988, and I had just graduated with an Associate of Arts degree with honors from St. Petersburg Junior College in Clearwater, Florida. U2, Public Enemy, and hip-hop were emerging on the airwaves. I had been accepted to the University of Florida in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences as a speech communication undergraduate seeking my Bachelor of Arts degree. I had a small scholarship from the UF speech and debate team, and I was organizing furniture, books, clothes, and personal effects for a move to Gainesville, Florida. While this was going on, my girlfriend, Trina Alt, partially decided that we were no longer meant to be and broke up with me. I was completely devastated. But on the bright side, I was single again and destined to become a full-fledged Florida Gator. It was a very exciting time in my life, filled with dreams and aspirations, and I really wanted to be successful, productive, and efficient with my studies at the University of Florida and ensure that I secured my Bachelor of Arts degree in communication. At places like the University of Florida, however, you don't just go to school. There is a very active party scene there, filled with moments of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. As well, there are many extracurricular activities to engage in throughout the university. You'll have to recall that I was a varsity debater at the University of Florida, which required a lot of time and dedication for practice rounds and trips to other universities for competition. It seemed like we took 2 to 3 trips per month somewhere in the United States for active competitive engagement. As a result, I have seen many of the states in the U.S. and visited numerous university campuses to compete in debate tournaments. For my junior year, I was heavily involved in intellectual competition on behalf of the university and rarely made it to the various parties and events on campus. Being a debater meant you had to engage in a lot of reading and research on the topic area selected by the National Debate Committee. So, when I was not traveling with a squad somewhere, I was usually in the library reading books and journal articles to secure evidence for competition. This was the beginning of my intense relationship with doing heavy library research. I spent several hours every day in the library, taking notes and photocopying evidence. In fact, I was considered a leading researcher on our team. If you needed to know information on a particular argument, I always had positions and evidence in my research tub to provide a basis for counterposition. I was regularly considered the go-to guy for information as a result of my dutiful and responsible research behavior, which would serve me well throughout life, both personally and professionally. However, there were many parties and dances to attend. Something was always going on campus, and it usually involved beer, alcohol, weed, and for some who chose to be a little bit more aggressive, cocaine. I steered clear from the cocaine because I didn't want to get involved with that crowd, not to mention the fact that cocaine is a highly dangerous substance which would inevitably threaten your very life. Many of the parties were completely insane and usually backed by a fraternity. I never really understood the point of belonging to a fraternity. You basically have to pay a monthly membership due just to be associated with a group of people who might or might not actually be your friend. So for the most part, I stuck with my speech and debate crowd. On occasion, I would visit some of the crazier parties. There was always something going on at UF. One of my close friends was Stephen Edinger, who happened to also come from Oldsmar. We went to high school together. He was a marketing major in the business school, and we would regularly eat pizza and play Nintendo in his dorm room. One weekend, his dorm area council was throwing a homecoming dance in the commons area. 2 hours before the dance, we started drinking beer with shots of tequila. By the time the dance came around, we were feeling pretty good and wanted to see what kind of girls came to the event. On that night, in October 1998, I would meet Brenda Antorvesa, who 5 years later would become my wife. When we met, there was automatic chemistry and attraction. We danced, laughed, and kissed for what must have seemed like hours. She was Hispanic, hailing from Colombian and Peruvian ancestry, but was mostly raised in New York by her mother. She was drop-dead gorgeous, a lot of fun, and we had an instant bond. For the next 2 years, we were inseparable on campus. Of course, like any relationship, we had our share of ups and downs, but everyone started to recognize us as an official couple. And I even made several trips to Cape Coral, Florida, to meet her mother and father who lived there. Along the way, I started performing really well in school with a 3.5 grade point average. As well, I was securing plenty of first, second, and third place trophies in debate. The president of the university even awarded me an outstanding undergraduate certificate based upon my performance in speech and debate. And at the end of my junior year, a paper that I had written for one of my classes in communication was accepted for presentation at the DePaul University Undergraduate Honors Colloquium. This colloquium was a high honor because it was a gateway to graduate school for your master's or doctorate degrees. Of course, I went to the colloquium and presented my paper, which resulted in me being recruited to Purdue University and the University of Wisconsin to engage my master's studies. That's when the thought of becoming a professor started to emerge in my mind. I enjoyed doing research on all kinds of topics. And I was very, very good in the library, reading old books and notes and things of that sort. And I was really good at writing papers. So I started to investigate the possibility of going to graduate school. Of course, there were many football games to go to, and the Florida Gators were always good at football and basketball. So there were sporting events which held regional and national significance. We would regularly play Miami, Florida State, Alabama, Georgia, Vanderbilt, LSU, and so on and so on. There was always an opportunity to root for the orange and blue somewhere on campus. And whenever I could, I would always go to the sporting events with Brenda, and we would cheer on the Gators. It was a lot of fun, and I cherished the foundational education that I received at the University of Florida wholeheartedly. And to this very day, I always root for Florida in competitive matchups. I even have a Florida Gator logo tattooed on my right arm that I got when I was vacationing in Amsterdam. Obviously, I didn't feel the pain of getting the tattoo at the time. During this period, my Peruvian girlfriend Brenda and I started to get closer and closer together on a relationship basis. We would vacation together, meet one another's parents, do study hall together, eat lunch together. And while my old girlfriend Trina Alt was off partying in the Tampa Bay area, I was building a new relationship that had significant foundation and potential. Brenda was also very well read, but mostly on educational theory and practice among elementary school youth. She was getting her bachelor's in education and wanted to stay an additional year to get her master's. Like me in competitive debate, Brenda was an active opera singer with a university choir group. She was particularly gifted at the classics. She could regularly bring her audiences to tears with her performances. But even though she was gifted at singing, her real success was in the education classrooms. She was considered a rising star in Florida education and had a bright future ahead of her as a teacher and possible administrator. Both she and I were dedicated, intelligent, young, passionate, adventurous, and connected at the hip. I especially liked the fact that she was Hispanic because I had a secret sexual fetish about Latina women. Together, she and I would practice Spanish and enjoy sampling Hispanic food and culture. Florida has a large population of Hispanics that come from all over South America, and it is very easy to fall in love with the different cultures and nationalities throughout South America, particularly the Cubans. But what I experienced with Brenda was a passion and a zeal for life that Trina just did not have at the time. I would not call the love that I had for Brenda romantic in the sexual sense. Our relationship was built upon the foundation of mutual respect and appreciation for each other's intellect, curiosity, and responsibility to life. Brenda was Catholic in the Latino tradition and very faithful to her rosary beads, whereas I had been raised Baptist, leaning Pentecostal, with American nationalism in my blood and a love for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Brenda was a Democrat, leaning centrist, and an active advocate for the arts in Florida. Somehow, we had reached political détente and were both hungry to expand the reach of our mutual credibility as a team throughout the state of Florida. After all, Florida was our home, and both of us bled orange and blue. Florida was the good, Georgia was the bad, and Florida State was the ugly. Why? Because God must be a gator too. He made the sun orange and the sky blue. We knew we were at the best university in the state of Florida, and Brenda and I relished in our positive influence throughout the institution. It was a very fascinating experience where I actually felt in my heart the love of being accepted by an institution as a lifelong family member. The feeling and sense of belonging was almost overwhelming psychologically. Acceptance into the Gator Nation was a worldview and paradigm shift of critical importance. We were being bestowed with credibility and professionally branded as sanctioned commodities of the university. We loved everything about Florida, including the beaches, the people, the politics, the culture, the competition, the exposure to new people and places, and even the relaxed Florida lifestyle. In the summer of 1989, I had secured a competitive internship with Eckerd Drugs and was considering going into the pharmaceutical sales industry, which, in hindsight, could have been a very lucrative professional path to take. I'm often regretful that I did not pursue a path in pharmaceutical sales because of the compensation potential that I missed out on by choosing to be a teacher. Pharmaceutical sales executives are compensated very nicely, which is why pharmaceutical prices at the store for retail are so stupidly high. All my friends who pursued their path in pharmaceutical sales have several homes, drive luxury cars, have great health insurance, and have big fat 401k retirement plans. For your information, higher education in the United States of America does not really compensate their professors well whatsoever. The most I have ever made in the United States as a professor was $72,000 a year. Pharmaceutical sales reps average between $120,000 and $150,000 a year. That's a huge difference in compensation, especially considering having the desire to raise a family. But for some reason, the path that I have chosen seems to be low for compensation unless you are working in the Middle East, which actually recognizes your credentials. But we'll talk about the Middle East later on in this book. Anyway, at any point, I never in my life would have imagined that I would be working in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates at this juncture of my life. I had a domestic worldview, particularly of the United States of America, which was Florida-centric, and the concept of international travel hadn't even crossed my mind. I was a good old Southern boy from Florida and had a beautiful Peruvian girlfriend. She was free of drugs, didn't smoke, liked beer, pool, was a true gator, and had a really good heart. Everything was falling into place. At the beginning of my senior year, I sought a course to improve my excellence in competitive speech and debate, and also become involved in student government politics. Meanwhile, Jeff Alt and I continued to have conversations on the telephone about politics and world affairs, and even his stepdaughter, Trina. Occasionally, he would visit Gainesville, and we would have breakfast together. He said he wanted me to go to Nicaragua with him and several of his Marine buddies and do some CIA-approved covert action. But my life had developed significantly since living in Tampa, and I was concentrating on running an anti-Greek political social movement on the University of Florida campus. The name of our party was the Today Party, and we had picked a Hispanic male, African American male, and Caucasian female ticket of 3 to run for the 3 major executive positions. I really liked the idea of being a political consultant running political campaigns, and started to see some actual potential for my degree in communication. In speech and debate, I'd become successful as a regional and in-state competitor, but I never really performed well at national competitions. I always attributed that to my Southern dialect. My accent sounds a little funny to some people. In the Southeast, I always placed first, second, or third. On a national level, I was just not that effective. It was December 1989, and I had just finished running the tab room for our Gator tournament at UF. That's where I met the head coach for Florida State University, Jim Bray. Jim was an obnoxious fellow, but had a heart of pure gold. He always wore a baseball cap with a Seminole logo on it and was never short of Gator jokes. When I first met him, I didn't like him too much. Not only was he a Seminole, but he was a Democrat. A liberal Democrat. Not much farther away from being a communist, if you ask me. Anyway, he questioned me. He wanted to know what I had in mind for my future and whether or not I might consider coming to Florida State University for my master's and possible doctorate degrees. In exchange for coaching the team there at Florida State, I would receive free tuition, a monthly living stipend, and a parking place on campus. I've been thinking about going to graduate school anyway, so I told him yes, that I was interested. He got my address and telephone number, and then had an application to the graduate school mailed to my Gainesville address. I completed the application, mailed it to Florida State University, and promptly forgot about it. While all of this was going on, I was the founder and chair of the student party designed to upset the apple cart of fraternity ownership of the power structure which dictated whose turn it was to be elected president of SGA. The fraternities, the Greeks, had control of SGA. And me, I was constantly on campus, rarely in class, always giving political speeches on the quad. At times, we had rather large crowds to speak to, and frequently held communal barbecues. Somehow, and I'm not really sure how, I lost control of the power structure of our political party, and I soon found myself in direct opposition with our selected presidential candidate. He wanted me gone, and I really didn't want to leave. I invested a lot of time, energy, money, and personal resources in order to be able to generate the press necessary for the formation of the party. We were all over the student newspapers, the student radio, and student cable television. and I recognized that all the work and dedication that I put into this task might be for no currency whatsoever. Our presidential candidate didn't like me, and he called me one night and relieved me of my position as party chair. "You're fired." I was devastated. The news hit the student newspapers, and I was personally embarrassed. People kept asking me what had happened. I was angry. I was furious. And I went into a downhill slump. I started drinking. I started smoking again. I stopped going to class. And the only person I would talk to was Brenda, who realized how hurt and sick I was over the negative press. It was the first time that I had truly suffered depression. But back then, no one really knew about depression. You were either in a slump or you just simply had the blues. My case lasted for about 3 months. During all of this, I went to the election night party where results were coming in and realized that the Greeks had swept the elections. I was quietly pleased about this after the jerking around by Juan Vitale. And when I saw the presidential candidate outside, he started shouting at me, calling me insane over and over. Well, that kind of pissed me off. So I told him that I'd just kick his ass. It just so happened that the dean of students heard me and informed Juan that what I had said was an actionable threat. I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a remark, but it was a threat. The University Student Conduct Board sent me a certified letter one day in the mail informing me that they would have a conduct hearing because of the threat that I had issued. So I slumped back into depression mode once the news was reported in student newspapers. To make a long story short, the university ended up putting a letter of reprimand in my file, and we called it a day. Importantly, you have to realize that this was my first bout with manic depression. I would work for 3 days straight and collapse for 2 days. There was no regularity to my schedule, and I was starting to miss exams on campus, which drastically affected my grades during the last semester. Somehow, I managed to pass all of my classes that semester and clear graduation check in the spring of 1990. Jeff Alt wanted me to come work for him at the moving company in Tampa, but instead I moved back in with my parents and took an assistant manager's job at Eckerd Drugs, running a retail pharmaceutical outlet. While I ran the accounting for the entire store, I also had the luxury of stocking tampons in the women's hygiene aisle. Obviously, this was going to be a dead-end job. I'd applied to about 15 or 20 jobs after graduation, but heard nothing back from anyone on a positive note. Then suddenly, in the middle of the summer 1990, I got my acceptance letter to go to graduate school at Florida State University in communication with funding, tuition completely covered, and a living stipend. I could either continue stocking tampons for Eckerd Drugs, or I could go back to school and get my master's degree. I was so broke financially that it seemed to make a lot of sense to go back to school. So I got in my car, drove up to Tallahassee, completed the paperwork for enrollment and registration, and bought some Seminole t-shirts. We would start to go off in different directions anyway, and I thought it would be good to be only a 2-hour car drive away from Brenda. She had 3 years left at Florida, and we could have a serious distance relationship while I completed my master's degree within 2 years. Chapter 3, From Partying Gator to Serious Seminole. In the summer of 1990, after graduating with my Bachelor of Arts in Speech Communication from the University of Florida, I was busy preparing and packing my personal effects for a move to Tallahassee to enter Florida State University as a graduate student seeking my Master of Science in Communication. Brenda and I were still on extremely good terms, and personally committed to making a long-distance relationship work. So, I packed all my personal effects in cardboard boxes, filling my 1988 Camaro up to the brim, and headed to Tallahassee to move into a one-bedroom apartment studio. In return for free tuition, a monthly living stipend, free parking on campus, and access to health services at the student infirmary, I would be required to coach and travel with the speech and debate team and teach 2 basic public speaking courses. No longer was I a mere student in class, for I would be teaching classes at FSU as an independent instructor of record. While supervised to some extent, I was essentially a teacher in my own right. The FSU speech and debate team, if you don't know, has a long history of creating some very noteworthy people, dignitaries, and even celebrities. I really didn't realize how active FSU speech and debate really was until I joined the squad as a coach. The head coach at FSU, Jim Bray, decided to put me in charge of individual events, which meant that I would be governing the development of our students who practiced prepared speaking, limited preparation speaking, and the dramatic interpretation of literature. I found this to be all the more appealing because I was given an independent budget and a lot of freedom in terms of managing the tournaments we would enter. However, because I was a Gator, a lot of the Seminoles really did not like me that much. If you don't know, the principal rivalry in state is between Florida and Florida State. They are arch enemies. It is an old and bitter rivalry that affects everyone right around Thanksgiving each year when the 2 teams play football. Some celebrate it lightly with humor and tongue-in-cheek, and some folks are darn right nasty about the whole thing. However, make no mistake about it, when the Gators and Seminoles play each other in football every year, families are literally torn apart. My very close friends at the University of Florida, for some reason, turned on me. The rivalry between the 2 institutions is just that strong. Best friends, allies, people I thought would always be in connection with me, decided that I was now a Seminole. They called me Gator Traitor, and they started telling me Seminole jokes, always commenting afterwards, "Now that you're a Seminole." For some reason, probably out of stupidity, I kept wearing my University of Florida orange and blue gear at Florida State University. I was loyal orange and blue, and folks would just have to deal with it. And this is when Bobby Bowden and Steve Spurrier were trading national championships in football between the 2 institutions. It was a really exciting time to be a Gator, and it was also a really exciting time to be a Seminole. My love for Florida State University comes in the fact that I truly received what I believe to be an Ivy League education from some of the finest minds from Princeton, Yale, and the University of Pittsburgh, all top-tier elite institutions for the price of a state matriculation waiver. Whereas at the University of Florida, I partied a lot and learned about the political aspects of building a personal network among your best friends for professional purposes. At FSU, instead, I received a top-notch education. It all depends upon what you want from your institution, I think, but my professors at FSU were far more impressive than those that I encountered at the University of Florida. I really don't feel like I was tested at the University of Florida, but the professors at FSU were very internationally competitive and made sure that their protégés were being challenged in paradigmatic ways. I received more personal attention from FSU than I did UF. Everything about Florida State University in my experience was more competitive and aggressive than the University of Florida. The entire culture at FSU was built around being the very best in whatever metrics were being measured. The psychological advantage of being the person or group who defines excellence by its very terms was the entire group culture at Florida State. Each school, Florida and Florida State, overlap in certain areas of excellence. Florida is known for some really great programs in medicine, law, nuclear studies, and particularly the School of Business. Florida State has a great international relations program, and the School of Communications is always top ranked. And as you might expect, within a year's time, I was wearing Seminole propaganda and proudly claiming allegiance with both the University of Florida and Florida State University. In fact, I also have a Seminole tattoo on my left arm that I got when I was vacationing in Amsterdam, same time as the gator tattoo. I guess you could say that I am bipolar. I enjoyed living on my own without a roommate at Florida State University. It was a very nice experience being able to do whatever you wanted to do, whenever you wanted to do it. So I made the decision to really apply myself to this opportunity and experience and make the most of it. I wanted to see what would actually happen if I focused and concentrated on my study. So I started spending a lot more time in the library. It was kind of my second home. Of course, I bought all the textbooks that my professors required and recommended, and set forth a path to read everything that I possibly could. Books, textbooks, journal articles, book chapters, editorial pieces, presses and imprints of the right, presses and imprints of the left, newspapers, magazines, what have you. The objective was to acquire knowledge, hopefully in the pursuit of wisdom. In an effort to stay loyal to Brenda, I concentrated on my education and my work, and it worked for the most part. My decision to focus upon the development of myself and my professional reputation kept me out of a lot of trouble in Tallahassee. All of the teachers at FSU had something of significance to offer. There were historians, there were theorists, practitioners, disciplinary generalists, and everyone was actively publishing. Because our teachers were publishing, we were also expected to assist in the effort. My major professor was Marilyn J. Young, and she was in the business of publishing books. She was the most hardcore scholar in the entire college and made sure that I had a sophisticated, cosmopolitan worldview and understood that research defines the work of a scholar. As a result, to this day, I have an extremely active research agenda. The lessons she taught me in my early 20s have remained consistent with me into my 50s. She used to tell me that a scholar's research is what defines his or her professional reputation, and I believe her. Dr. Young was noted for her studies on propaganda tactics from the Soviet Union. Her husband, Michael Launer, was both English and Russian bilingual, and they frequently took trips to Moscow to do field research. This was my first experience in seeing that your research could pull you away from the United States into international contexts. It was very exciting. I often wondered where my research and professional agenda would take me. But I was 23 years old and still had a domestic mindset. For my master's thesis, I studied Congressman Newt Gingrich's use of targeted buzzwords for campaign communications on behalf of Republican challenger opponents. The topic was perfect for my thesis committee, and it was interesting enough that I published several journal articles on the notion. However, my real education at FSU would not begin until I had earned my master's degree and started the doctoral program. I really don't recall partying as much in Tallahassee as I did in Gainesville. Tallahassee was a much more serious learning environment, and my commitment to Brenda kept me from interacting with other women. About once a month, I would drive 2 hours to Gainesville and stay with Brenda in her dorm room for the weekend. Sometimes Brenda would come to Tallahassee and visit me. But both of us were very serious, dedicated, and committed to each other and our studies. Of course, we went to the occasional football game and would drink beer with our cohort, but it was all just good college fun. When my doctoral studies began in 1992, Marilyn Young told me that I needed to pick a dissertation topic that had the potential, the possibility of becoming my first book on the academic marketplace. For about a year, I stayed in the library searching through hundreds of topics trying to find my way in the jungle of information overload that is the library. But it wasn't until I visited Brenda's parents' house and discovered a treasure trove of historical documents relating to the Peruvian social movement known as Shining Path. Brenda's mother had several books on the Maoist social movement, and it just so happened that Brenda's grandfather was the colonel of the Peruvian anti-terrorism task force in Lima known as DENCOTE. Brenda's mother had original notes and strategies from the government written, authored by her father, and handed them over to me. So, it seems, I was finally in business with a significant topic. As my work with the FSU speech and debate team started coming to an end, and I finished my last classes required to become ABD, which is all but dissertation, I began applying for jobs. Really didn't matter where the job was at the time. I just needed employment that would allow me to complete the dissertation remotely from Tallahassee. So I started looking for instructor positions, while Brenda and I set a date to get married in 1993. It was time to get serious about life, and Brenda wanted to enter the classroom as soon as possible. After going on interviews to Missouri and Tennessee and Minnesota and Mississippi, the best offer for me emerged and came from the University of Arkansas system based in Little Rock. With their branch campus in Monticello, Arkansas, I found a job. So in May 1993, all of our friends and family from both the University of Florida and Florida State University gathered in Cape Coral, Florida, where Brenda and I exchanged our lifetime vows. All my friends were there, all of her friends were there, and it made for a very, very interesting and rich party. Everyone had a blast. An American Southern culture mixed with Peruvian South American culture, and we danced and ate and drank and celebrated the beginning of Brenda and my mutual existence as man and wife. So Brenda and I started packing our belongings and furniture for a move from Florida to Monticello, Arkansas. Both of us would be saying goodbye to the University of Florida and Florida State University. For that matter, we would be saying goodbye to our friends and family in Florida. Monticello was about a 15 to 16 hour drive from Tampa. We loaded up on Gator and Seminole memorabilia and started driving west. As you already know, I was born in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So in June of 1993, when I signed my first contract as an instructor of speech communication at the University of Arkansas at Monticello, it was something of a symbolic homecoming for me. You see, I really didn't remember Arkansas from my youth, but the thought of returning to my birth state for work was personally very appealing. Not only would I get the chance to be gainfully employed and use my master's degree from Florida State, but my wife and I would have the excellent opportunity to get to know one another better in what I perceived to be a very wholesome, family-oriented farm environment. Monticello, Arkansas was in the southeast corner of the state. The general area was commonly referred to as the Arkla-Miss region. Monticello had a population of about 5,000 people, all in total, and the main industries were cattle, pine logging, and cotton farming. As a result, Most of the population was somehow involved with the farm industry and agricultural pursuits. In fact, the University of Arkansas at Monticello was known for being the forestry institute and agricultural hub for the state. Most of the students there were engaged in completing their general education so that they could go on and major in either agriculture or forestry. So it was definitely the agrarian hub. My wife Brenda traveled with me after our wedding in Florida to Monticello, Arkansas to set up shop and get our apartment situated with used furniture and the essentials of domestic life. She interviewed with several elementary schools in Monticello, but finally landed a job in Hamburg, Arkansas, which was about a 30-minute drive south from Monticello. So the good news was we were both finally employed, and I would have the chance to establish life with my new bride and complete the research on my dissertation. Arkansas is known for a lot of things. Tyson chicken farms, the Arkansas Razorbacks, Bill Clinton, Walmart, and even rumors of CIA involvement during the 70s and 80s in Mena, Arkansas for airlifting large amounts of cocaine into the USA, presumably Colombian and Peruvian cocaine. Rumors, mind you. From my personal experience, all I encountered was a lot of good, wholesome people who put in a full day's work and went to church on Sunday with their family and worshiped God. By and large, my experiences in the state of Arkansas were very good. During the early 1990s, the Arkansas educational system was experiencing significant growth and expansion with adequate funding from the state as a result of Governor Bill Clinton and his administration fueling higher education with an enhanced curriculum, increased out-of-state teacher recruitment, and a rapidly developing communication infrastructure derived from fiber optics. In fact, even though I was a mere instructor at the University of Arkansas at Monticello, every year I had the opportunity to secure a new state-of-the-art personal computer. You will have to remember that this was the beginning of the rise in personal computer technology, and IBM clones, PC clones, and Macintosh computers were coming out with new systems at an extraordinarily rapid pace. It just so happened that my office was next door to the computer network analyst for the university, and we became very close friends. As a result, I had the opportunity to learn all about VAX VMS mainframe computing interconnected by fiber optics. My first 2 years in Arkansas were spent teaching 4 classes a semester, offering substantial service to the community through workshops and trying to conduct an original research agenda. In addition, during my free time at the university and late into the nights and weekends, I was gathering research materials on my dissertation topic, Radical Maoist Guerrilla Warfare in Peru by the Shining Path Militant Insurgency. The reason I selected this topic, of course, is that my wife and her family were politically influential in the counterterrorism operations for the secret police in the Republic of Peru. Her grandfather was the director of counterterrorism operations for the Peruvian National Police Force. So, I had family reasons for studying this topic, not to mention the fact that I was highly interested in American extrahemispheric operations in Latin America. However, whenever I told someone about my research and my topic, they typically looked at me very strangely and asked why I would dare choose such a topic. A lot of folks considered me a radical simply because of the topic that I selected to focus my dissertation on. It used to bother me a great deal, but a lot of folks, you see, they just considered me to be a little off in terms of topic selection, mainly because of the topic. I had direct family access to the top brass of the Peruvian National Police Force and intelligence operatives who frequently sent me original historical documents and artifacts related to the war against Shining Path. On occasion, we would receive DHL and FedEx packets containing charts, statistics, videotapes, and even classified documents. It all made for a very good, high-end, quality dissertation, and my computer skills had grown considerably thanks to Arkansas's focus on creating a distributed, decentralized research infrastructure throughout the state, thereby interconnecting and interweaving all the universities, research institutions, and even governmental operations by way of something called the Internet. One of my favorite tools that I like to use online for research is called LexisNexis, and it is a massive database of news articles, reports, transcripts, news wires, and general stories written by reporters, editors, and influential authors around the world. The LexisNexis database contains news from almost every country in the world, translated into perfect English with full text access. In addition, you'll have to remember that this was 1993, and email was just becoming popular among academics and researchers. Back in the day, the internet was just a domain of textual representations. There were no graphics or audio files or Netflix or Amazon.com. You logged into a textual interface on your computer and you interacted with a data prompt. The most amazing thing on the internet, for me, was a service called Gopher, developed at the University of Minnesota, which is the home of the Golden Gophers. This system allowed you to browse text. You basically used your cursor keys to navigate a textual document with highlighted words to be transferred virtually to other documents. It was just text. There were no photographs, images, or music. But I realized then that it was a matter of time before our computers would become powerful enough to start becoming multimedia enhanced and networked. It wasn't much of a logical leap at all to understand that software and photographs and graphics and video and downloadable applications would eventually be streaming through these fiber optic cables piped into our offices, internetworking us all into a fantastic group consciousness. My wife, fortunately, was very understanding that I had to spend a lot of my free time after work and on the weekends pulling basically a double shift to get my Florida State University research done. After all, who wants to go through all the expense, energy, and time invested in a doctoral coursework and not complete the degree? So my first 2 years were spent in Arkansas collecting data, building my back files, and creating an organized system of evidence that would make a Harvard lawyer look stupid. After our first year in Arkansas, my mother-in-law suggested that we actually go to Lima, Peru for Christmas and visit the family. Well, the thought of going overseas was immediately exciting and enchanting. However, it was 1993 and the Shining Path guerrillas were still active in Peru. Accordingly, I hesitated quite a bit about going to Peru because of the conflict. However, I was assured by everyone that we would be very safe and in good hands politically. I really didn't realize at the time just what being politically connected really meant, but it sounded pretty good to me, so I figured, why not? In early December 1993, while I was writing my dissertation and spending many late hours in the library, my wife and I packed our things and drove from Monticello to Little Rock, Arkansas to board the plane. We made our way to Miami, where we met my wife's mother and sister and stayed the night in a relative's house before going back to the airport with our international tickets. I was filled with adrenaline, fully excited, and even downright petrified. This was my first international trip, and my cherry was being busted by going to a country that was actively engaged in insurgency by Maoist guerrillas. The four of us boarded the flight, which would last about 6 hours. I remember flying over Cuban airspace, thinking to myself, what in the hell am I doing? Fidel Castro is down there, and I am willingly and voluntarily, under my own volition, going to Lima, Peru, which is a state and city under siege. I had to laugh. There was clearly something wrong with me, but the thrill was addictive. People say that heroin is addictive to the right person, but I'm here to tell you that adrenaline is equally addictive to a power junkie. And these were my first steps into a vast new world where fear, intrigue, and political dynamics feed the rush of someone who is seeking power and influence in both their personal and professional life. I was hyperventilating at points on the plane due to the adrenaline, and this was my first high, which was thoroughly pleasurable. Like they say, it's never as good as the first time. We landed in Lima, and the airplane tires screeched on the runway. My first indication that I was no longer in Arkansas was when the entire plane broke out into applause and cheers, appreciative of a safe landing. The Peruvians are an emotional and expressive people. We walked through the airport, cleared customs, got our luggage, and headed outside the airport to meet the family. When we finally connected with the Peruvian family and friends outside, I remember counting 8 people in total who were there to greet us. Peruvian families stay together in packs, and it is a deep sign of disrespect not to meet your family member arriving at the airport if they have made an international journey just to see you. So counting the 8 people who were there, and us, that made a total of 12 people. Unfortunately, there was only one car, a 1962 Ford, which would be our ride back to the family house with all of our luggage. People sat on one another's laps. Luggage was stacked to the ceiling of the car. And when I suggested that we hire a taxi, everyone was shocked and offended, deeply offended that I would suggest such a notion. So I just shut my mouth and began my adventure into cultural adaptation. You know, you must be very flexible when you're dealing with other cultures and people in order to assimilate. If you remain inflexible, people will grow to hate you, and your entire experience will be negative. As we were driving away from the airport, I remember smelling gasoline in the air. I thought it was strange, but it constantly presented itself wherever we went. Little did I realize, but Lima had a problem with emission smog, and in 1993, they had not yet converted to unleaded gasoline, so the air was foul. I made sure to get a window seat in the car so that I could see all the sights while we were driving through the city on our way home. Again, adrenaline was pumping through my body. However, about 100 yards away from the airport, we were stopped at a police checkpoint, a military police checkpoint, and everyone had to get out of the car while it was thoroughly searched, including the luggage. To my right was a machine gun turret surrounded by sandbags. The sight made me nervous. In the United States, the land of the free and home of the brave, you rarely, if ever, see military presence out in the civilian sector. But here in Peru, military vehicles, tanks, soldiers, and checkpoints were very common. After all, according to my research, the country was on the brink of a civil war. My virgin eyes were being flooded with stimuli, and my heart was pounding from the rush. I would be spending Christmas that 1993 with my new family, literally in a war zone. Arkansas and the United States were far, far away. I was immersed in a new culture where the language was Spanish and everyone was gun-shy from the military conflict with Sendero. The first night, as I laid in bed, I stared at the ceiling for about 3 hours, wondering why I had done this. Who willingly places themselves in a dangerous military context. Why had I listened to my wife and mother-in-law? Why was I there? There were more questions than answers, and I didn't go to sleep that night until 3 o'clock in the morning. The sounds in the distance that December 1993 seemed to be of sporadic gunfire. I woke up at noon, went downstairs to the kitchen on the second floor, and everyone in the family happily and smilingly greeted me. There were lots of kisses and hugs, and my 2 years of Spanish in high school and 2 years of Spanish in college helped me understand, at a basic level, what everyone was saying. However, I found it very difficult to find the vocabulary in Spanish to be able to conjugate verbs properly in order to communicate. There was a lot of hand language and gestures on my part. Then, one of my favorite people, Aunt Rosie, handed me a cup of coffee. I drank it slowly, and it was delicious. They have a very different system of brewing coffee in Latin America, and the beans and brewing process make the coffee divine. In addition to the great coffee, we had fresh bread and butter from the local bakery around the corner. Mama Meche, Brenda's grandmother, even suggested that I try some mango preserves that she had made. I could tell from the apartment that this was an average middle-class Peruvian family. There was no extreme wealth, and everyone worked several jobs to bring money home for overall family operations. It was a family commune. Everyone shared and shared alike. These were good people making the best of what they had, and they were loving, caring, and now considered me part of their family by extension of marriage. Brenda and I walked around the neighborhood for a couple of hours, which was generally safe. It was your average Peruvian neighborhood, and the architecture was basic Spanish condo structure. Every house there had 2 or 3 or 4 levels to it, and each family occupied a specific floor in the building. The seniors lived on the bottom floor, which did not require going up and down stairs, and the rest of the family occupied the second and third floors. On the roof, there was typically a clothesline and a patio table. In the distance, you could see the different apartment buildings, shops and restaurants, and government buildings off in the distance. It was a downright beautiful sight to behold, although it was drastically different from what you would ever see in the United States. We talked and talked in basic Spanish, and my wife Brenda would translate for me when things got complex because she was completely bilingual in English and Spanish. I thoroughly enjoyed the interactions with my new family. The bread was miraculous. The coffee was wonderful. The discussion was enlightening. Then suddenly, Aunt Rosie announced that it was time for lunch. All the women headed to the kitchen and started preparing the meal. All the men sat around the table, smoking and drinking coffee and chatting. Then the meal was served. Rice, green corn tamales, roasted chicken, mixed vegetables, and plenty of hot sauce. I instantly fell in love with the green corn tamales. Verde choclo. They were delicious. We ate and laughed and talked in broken Spanglish and simply enjoyed one another's company. Later in the day, Brenda and her mother took me downstairs to meet Brenda's grandfather. His name was Hector Arguto, and he was a retired Peruvian police colonel who managed counterterrorism operations in Lima. He was partially bald, dark-skinned, and was expressively happy to meet me for the first time. When I told him that I was doing my research to complete my dissertation and the topic was on counterterrorism operations in Peru, he became very excited. He told me that he had original documentation in his desk that might be of use. He had a small library filled with all sorts of different books on international relations, and counterterrorism strategy, all of which were in Spanish. But he also had some books written in Spanish that had been imported to Peru from the Soviet Union. I found this strange, but given the former Soviet Union's influence in Latin America, it seemed to make sense. From a researcher's perspective, it's one thing to read about how the Soviet Union influenced Latin America, but it's another thing to see it with your own eyes. That's when you really realize that you're not in Arkansas anymore. I thumbed through his library, which contained books on philosophy, politics, military strategy, and law enforcement techniques. It seemed that he was very well read, although it was clear that he was not paid well and was now living on a scant pension. My wife Brenda explained to me that many of the police officers in Peru are very wealthy because they work in conjunction with the narco-trafficking industry. She assured me that her grandfather was an honest police officer, which made sense, and I concluded the family was just a typical Peruvian household, which it was. We toured the upscale Miraflores district. We visited the Indian marketplace. We had all sorts of local handcrafts and trinkets offered to us at the various markets by Incan descendants. I tasted Inca Cola. We traveled throughout the city, stopping at roadside markets and street restaurants. We went to the downtown district where the government buildings were, and we generally enjoyed ourselves as tourists, with special family guidance as to where we should go and where we should not. I did see a government hospital building that had been destroyed by Shining Path ammonium nitrate fuel oil bombs, which was under reconstruction. And there were many beggars in the streets asking for your change, which, as everyone knows, is a sight becoming more popular, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. The sources that I had assembled during my spare time away from work were impressive and formidable, to say the very least. 5 plastic Contico tubs full of information specifically on the topic of Shining Path's Maoist insurgency and revolution tactics on an international scale. The CIA calls this type of research open source intelligence, because all of the documents are in the public realm and can be freely accessed by anyone with a library card. In my studies, I had reached the point where I was no longer doing research, but I was doing open source intelligence. Specifically, I was looking at the funding mechanism which gave birth to the narco-terrorist peasant uprising in Peru. It was around this time that my colleagues began questioning why I was doing this type of research. For in many circles, this was not your typical or ordinary topic. Most communication studies look at domestic events and communication campaigns of significance affecting the United States. It was very rare to have an international topic, and especially an international topic that looked at Marxist, Leninist, Maoist strategies of disabling Peru and the ensuring government response. Many of my colleagues to this day still do not understand why I selected the topic area for my research. During my first 2 years at the University of Arkansas at Monticello, I used every free moment possible to develop the writing on my dissertation. Marilyn Young had reminded me that most people who left Florida State without finishing their dissertation never completed their dissertation because they got too busy with life. I was certain that this was not going to be my case. So I pushed forward and I pushed hard to complete the research. I was hyper-vigilant to the task of completing my research. In all, I collected 1,500 documents and books, read them all page by page, constructed an excellent research paradigm, and had written a remarkable analysis of the open source intelligence between reported Shining Path international terrorism, and government response. At this time, it is important for the audience to understand the basic political and social context of the Shining Path War in Peru, because you have to remember, it was a war. Dr. Abimel Guzman, a professor of rhetoric, had gained notoriety in the 1980s for being the leader of the leftist political front emerging from the highlands of the Andes. Former university professor, trained in China with Maoist philosophy and strategy, Guzman apparently must have had one too many faculty meetings. He broke away from the university and took on the war name Comrade Gonzalo. His primary constituency were the farmers, who were mostly peasants in the coca fields. In terms of resource mobilization theory, Guzman was successful in financing the leftist Maoist movement to overthrow the Republic of Peru by using money derived from cocaine sales. This is why Shining Path is known as a narco front. The militarization of the leftist guerrillas with Soviet weaponry and political and philosophical backing by Russia and China happened because the insurgency was so effective at capturing and converting cocaine processing revenue. Guzman became a political celebrity among the poor of Peru and had amassed a decentralized social movement and insurgency that had become very effective at disabling the Peruvian government. Not only was the leftist front successful in converting cocaine revenue into arms, but the farmers had learned to make ammonium nitrate fuel oil bombs from a simple mixture of nitrate fertilizers for their crops and diesel fuel. The farmers turned revolutionaries would fill up the trunks of cars and pack trucks with ammonium nitrate fuel oil bombs and detonate them at key government facilities and police headquarters. Guzman's vision for the spread of communism was larger than Peru. Guzman considered himself the fourth sort of communism, following in the footsteps of Marx, Lenin, and Mao. His vision was to transform Peru into a socialist communist state and export Maoist philosophy throughout Latin and Central America, thereby transforming the continent into one communist state. Obviously, the government of Peru had its hands full trying to deal with Guzman and the insurgent attacks occurring throughout the republic. For that matter, the scale of military activity on a transnational sense involving Chinese and Russian involvement into the Peruvian theater caused the United States to become very concerned and involved with supporting the Peruvian government. During my 3 weeks vacation in Peru, which really wasn't a vacation but more of a research trip, I learned that a three-dimensional personal experience of an international situation was far more revealing than reading some mere articles and books. The reading that I had done on Peru and the Shining Path prepared me with the information necessary to understand what was going on in Lima. But there is absolutely no way I could have understood the gravity and reality of the situation unless I had actually visited the theater and seen it with my own eyes. The trip was a radical awakening to the realities of global interpolitical discourse and the competition of philosophies and policies on an international magnitude. Everywhere I looked, on the side of buildings, graffiti marking the communist hammer and sickle presence of communism could be seen throughout the city. Family members in Peru warned us not to go outside the city and to be completely aware of our surroundings at all times because the situation was so tense. I learned a lot. I was constantly panicking. I grew up a lot. And for the first time, my research seemed applied in nature with actual reality manifesting before my very eyes. There were lives in the balance of this situation. and real people were dying by the thousands. It was no longer just a study, it was real. As a direct result of Brenda's grandfather, Colonel Hector Arguto, I had all of his books and primary notes in Spanish detailing the government's internal response to the Maoist insurgency. I was now in possession of what was once classified Peruvian war strategy, which made my dissertation transform from a mere study to something of significance. Another one of our family members in Peru was known by the nickname Pepe. Remember that name. Jose Aliche Navarro, known as Pepe, was my cousin-in-law, and he happened to be the parliamentarian of the Peruvian National Congress. His sister worked for Univision and was able to secure hours of television reportage on the Shining Path turmoil. Because the information was of such a sensitive nature, we literally had to smuggle the videotapes and the notes from the commandant in our luggage back to the United States. We did so successfully. In terms of original artifacts, my trip to Peru was a complete and total success. I had strategic communications from the Peruvian National Police Anti-Terrorism Unit, videotape from Univision that was of a very sensitive nature, and direct email contact and communication with Pepe, who had tons of connections in Peru through his position as parliamentarian of the PNC. My trip to Peru really networked me well for my research and even future visits to Peru. In May 1995, I successfully defended my dissertation and secured the title Doctor in front of my name. My original research artifacts from Peru literally stunned my dissertation committee of 5. Marilyn Young commented at the dissertation defense that I was the most prepared candidate for my dissertation review that she had ever witnessed in the history of the College of Communication at Florida State. Finally, I had completed my education and could start focusing on the development of my career and professional trajectory. In addition, I could start networking on the job market to try and secure a position as an assistant professor at a large Division I research-oriented university. The next 3 years in Arkansas would be filled with an aggressive publication schedule and a stream of applications for a higher paying job. Chapter 4. Woo Pig Suey. So there we were. It was burning hot August 1995. I had finally completed my dissertation in May of 1995. I was now an esteemed PhD, and we were still in Monticello, Arkansas. The University of Arkansas at Monticello decided to reward me for obtaining my doctorate degree and promoted me from instructor rank to assistant professor rank on a tenure-track line, with a whopping $1,000 a year raise. That moved me from $28,000 a year to $29,000 a year. I was completely insulted and ignored several times when I tried to renegotiate for a better salary increase. Obviously, the University of Arkansas at Monticello did not exactly value my presence at the institution. Accordingly, I started working on my professional documents, CV, and portfolio in order to seek a new position elsewhere. Given the significant research that I'd done at Florida State, I wanted to be located at a major research institution that valued the time and energy invested in doing quality research. Anyway, Monticello, Arkansas was clearly not going to be that place. We had to leave. Period. It just wasn't worth it anymore. It was around this time when Microsoft's Windows 95 came out on the market and completely revolutionized the web experience for everyone in the world. America Online was also successfully distributing and decentralizing the internet for home use through dial-up modem connections and phone lines. I spent days and weeks trying to perfect my CV and professional portfolio for job applications in both print copy and online format. I went to every professional convention that I could possibly afford to go to, networking and meeting influential people at top research institutions. However, it was extremely difficult to make the argument that I was a significant researcher when I was based at UAM. Arkansas Monticello was a good move financially at first because it allowed me to complete my doctoral dissertation while working full-time over 2 years. But being located in an agrarian forestry institution teaching basic speech did not exactly afford me the credibility to position myself as a researcher of note, of significance. Later that year, I had the opportunity to take several of my students to the prestigious University of Oklahoma Sooner Undergraduate Communication Conference. The keynote speaker at this conference was Dr. Stephen A. Smith, and he was the University of Arkansas's leading researcher in political communication and rhetoric. He gave an extremely persuasive talk on the physical design and structure of legislative democratic forums and chambers throughout the world. It was clear that he was an outside-the-box thinker, so I approached him after his lecture to introduce myself. It was perhaps the wisest move I ever made. Dr. Smith was a very down-to-earth man. Even though he got his PhD from Northwestern and completed his First Amendment law studies at Harvard, he was approachable and extremely friendly. Little did I know, but he was a former Arkansas state legislator during the Clinton governorship and also served as executive assistant to Governor Bill Clinton. Over the years of knowing Steve, I came to discover and realize that he and Bill Clinton were actually best friends. Not only was Bill Clinton the godfather of Steve's 2 children, but Steve had Bill Clinton's personal cell phone on speed dial. It was very interesting knowing someone that had direct access to a sitting United States of America president. With that said, I was more interested in what Steve could possibly do for me by helping me land a job at the University of Arkansas located in Fayetteville, which is in the Ozarks. That's the flagship campus of the state. Home of the Razorbacks. Woo pig suey! It was clear that this was someone I could personally and professionally trust in terms of mentoring me and helping me network within the communication discipline. I was less concerned about his influence with the president and more concerned about building a sustainable friendship with him that would teach me the ways of the Jedi. So Steve and I became friends. We exchanged contact information, which included email addresses, and we began an online love affair through email. We would email each other regularly, 3 to 4 times a day, discussing topics of importance and the strategies involved in doing real research that could be published. He coached me on publication techniques and told me who the right people in the discipline were, and furthermore, who to make sure to steer clear of. We would tell one another jokes, and even though I classified myself as a Republican, he lovingly tolerated me. Steve was a liberal Democrat. Remember, not far from being a communist? And he was far more well-read than I was. I could hold basic conversations with him about some of the classics, citing Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but he was always able to prompt me with further thought on Quintilian, Cicero, Descartes, Chomsky, Sun Tzu, and Marx. He was in his prime as a scholar and considered to be nationally influential on several levels. I was very lucky to have someone of substance to to turn to who could give me honest and straightforward advice about my career in plain speak and the importance of engaging in quality research. He was, and has been, a long-standing ally and friend throughout all the turmoil in my life, and I value him not only as a colleague, but as a friend and actual brother. Steve is family. Every year at UAM, following the 1995 completion of my doctorate, was spent networking online, learning the basics of computer science, constantly applying for new jobs, and talking daily with Steve. As well, I was learning HTML, which is hypertext markup language, in order to be able to build online websites. This was in the days when you had to learn the code by hand. There were no HTML editors, and if you wanted a decent website, you had to code it from the ground up, source code to action. I spent most of my research time, unfortunately, engaged in website development, learning the advanced features of HTML, dynamic markup text, HTML5, JavaScript, and CSS. I even took a formal course in Visual Basic and C++, but those languages were not as appealing to me as what could be done on the web. I used to code so much during the day that at night I would have dreams about coding. Both Steve and I were website developers. My focus was on building the website for the Southern States Communication Association, and Steve had formed one for the American Communication Association. Steve and I were advanced webmasters, and the web was just beginning to emerge into existence as a meta-medium for all things that could be digitalized. In fact, I made several trips to Fayetteville from Monticello to stay with Steve in his house and talk about the nature of the developing web and what role we could play in maturing the discipline better online. Steve even mentioned during one of these trips that it might be possible sometime in the future for me to come up to Fayetteville as an assistant professor and become a Razorback. This thought appealed to me a great deal, on both an intellectual and emotional level. I wanted to join his network of allies, and he clearly wanted me there. However, little did I know, but it would take another 3 years of campaigning after getting my PhD to secure a better job before we would escape small-town Monticello. During this time, I perfected my HTML skills and started working with Steve on the American Communication Association website. In fact, in a 1996 meeting of the Board of Trustees for ACA, I was elected to be the editor-in-chief of a new online journal called the American Communication Journal. This was a high honor for someone so young. Most journal editors are in their 40s or 50s. And while I was making a big sound on the web, for some reason, my constant stream of applications to Carnegie One research institutions were entirely unsuccessful. Even Steve proved to be unsuccessful in getting me to the University of Arkansas. It was around this time, in the mid to late 90s, that President Clinton became immersed in the Monica Lewinsky scandal, which caused the Republican Party to fuel lawyer Kenneth Starr's so-called independent investigation of the Clintons. My affiliation with Steve had changed the dynamics of my politics, and I was a firm Clinton supporter. Not only were computer innovations coming out on a weekly basis, but the dot-com era had become a major player on Wall Street. People were getting filthy rich off Microsoft, Dell, Hewlett-Packard, Yahoo.com, Amazon.com, and the like. Bill Clinton had successfully ushered in both Steve Jobs and Bill Gates' interdependent visions of home computing, and the World Wide Web became an explosive economic growth model. It was a good time to be an academic, and it was a good time to be online. One day in early 1996, I came home from work and found my wife Brenda curled up in a ball, kicking the floor, wailing and crying. I got down on my knees and asked her what was wrong. She kept screaming over and over and over that she wanted a baby. I thought her mother had died, or possibly her sister, but her Catholic procreative instinct had manifested into total baby frenzy. I explained to her that we were not financially ready or stable enough to have children, and that we needed to wait for a couple of years until I could secure a better job. That only made her cry more. Obviously, this was how she was going to negotiate, bringing a new life into the world, Peruvian style. So I thought about it for a couple of months. I thought long and I thought hard. And then I agreed that we should start trying to have a child. After all, every husband wants to please his wife. I was just a little interpersonally disturbed that the conversation about children had come down to a ridiculous dramatic display of raw, unbridled emotions. So she got off the birth control and we stopped using condoms, and within 2 months she had conceived. The stick turned blue. We were going to be parents. It's really funny, you know. You spend your entire life trying to avoid the pregnancy of your partner, and then, in a series of extremely irrational and flamboyant negotiations, so-called negotiations, your entire life changes. During the 1990s, CNN was considered to be both a reliable and trustworthy news network. They were fairly objective and did not have an obvious globalist left bias like they do today. The Kenneth Starr investigation into Bill Clinton and Whitewater had been going on for several months. And then I got the shock of my life. There was video footage running on CNN of Dr. Stephen A. Smith being arrested at the University of Arkansas. I was completely floored. I was beside myself. What on earth had Steve done? CNN was reporting that Steve had been involved somehow with the McDougalls and Governor Jim Guy Tucker in some fraudulent bank loan activity in Arkansas. I knew that the Republicans and Kenneth Starr were dragging up all the possible dirt that they could find on Bill Clinton, and therefore this had to be politically motivated. And it was. I immediately emailed Steve at the University of Arkansas and asked him what in the hell was going on. Steve didn't respond. In 3 or 4 days, he wrote me back and said he had to be quiet because he was going through some very serious legal shit. I wrote him back, told him that I completely understood and that he had my personal and professional support and most of all love. I also told him to be strong because it was obvious that the Republican Party was moving toward the impeachment of Bill Clinton. I knew that Newt Gingrich and the GOP would use any means necessary in the House of Representatives and eventual Senate to try and dethrone Bill Clinton. The scandal was all over the news, and Steve and I stopped communicating for a couple of months, even though I sent him a steady stream of love and support. In conclusion, once the drama was over, Steve plea bargained a deal with the prosecutors to plead guilty to a misdemeanor count of misappropriation of a bank loan. But the press surrounding his involvement in Whitewater challenged him personally and psychologically for a duration of a couple of months, maybe a year. It was strange watching international newspapers and cable television outlets take your friend and brother, someone you held close to your heart, to the woodshed. I learned a lot about how the media can magnify things completely out of proportion and damage and wreck people's personal lives and professional reputations. Not only was Steve in trouble, but so was the President of the United States. When a political party wants to do a tar and feather campaign, a hit job on someone, it becomes a high-tech lynching. Any means necessary indeed. No one is spared. Professional networks, family affiliations, children, it doesn't matter. The press can be very cruel on people. People, human beings. Luckily, all of Steve's close personal and professional friends stood by his side, including me. Fuck Newt Gingrich. In the University of Arkansas, there was ample support for the Clintons and for Steve Smith. In 1996, despite all the scandals and mudslinging and name-calling and jokes and ridicule, President Bill Clinton was re-elected anyway. I had very personal reasons for becoming a Democrat. I started to hate the Republican Party and everything that it stood for because of the damage it did to my brother and his allies. Steve and I resumed communicating on an hourly basis, and somehow, I'm not really sure how, his humor and life outlook remained consistently positive, even though he had been publicly dragged through the dirt. From 1996 to 2000, Bill Clinton would continue to usher in a thriving economy, no major wars, and a domestic agenda that literally defined a generation. You might hate Bill Clinton. You might hate Hillary Clinton. You might think there are crooks and liars and thieves. But all I experienced from Clinton's Arkansas, from an insider's perspective, was innovative, progressive, forward-looking policy and politics that directly impacted people's lives and careers at the base level. While it is true that President Clinton had some personal shortfalls, admittedly, I tend to look at the politician and what he or she can do for the entire body politic. My affiliation with Steve on a personal level only made my allegiance to Bill Clinton that much stronger, and I never got to meet Bill Clinton. As they say, all politics is personal. Remember that. All politics is personal. In February of 1997, Brenda gave birth to our beloved son. Because of the sensitive nature of this book, my son has formally and personally requested that I not use his name. Anyway, even though I was quite hesitant about the idea and notion of having a child, the delivery of my son in Monticello, Arkansas, became one of the highlights of my life. Many people don't realize how serious it is to have a child. But your biological and psychological instincts go through a dramatic reformation when you become a parent. Everything seems to take on a much more serious and focused demeanor. As well, because of the feeding schedule for infants, you start losing a lot of sleep, diapers, formula, doctor visits, 3 a.m. feedings. Your entire life completely changes. The additional responsibility of being a parent weighed down my professional performance. As well, it was a significant financial burden on a meager teacher's salary. But the joy and love and peace and bond that I felt when I was holding my son in my arms is something that I will never, ever forget. And I wouldn't trade anything for it in the world. All the work was definitely worth it. However, taking care of a young infant and raising a child to maturity is easily 20 times more difficult than getting a PhD. I don't take much stock or account into what people have to say about life if they don't have children. You must go through the life process of raising a child, I believe, to understand what the word responsibility actually really means. And furthermore, I don't really think you are a parent unless you have a minimum of 2 children or more. From 1996 to 1998, I spent most of my professional time developing my webmastering skills and learning basic computer science. I published a little bit, but most of my work was invested in websites. At one of the American Communication Association conventions, I met a gentleman by the name of Paul Bearfield. Dr. Bearfield was the communication department chair at the University of Southwestern Louisiana in Lafayette, Louisiana, home of the Ragin' Cajuns, smack dab in the heart of Louisiana's French Cajun country. He asked me if I was interested in coming to the University of Southwestern Louisiana and explained to me that my website development skills could have huge potential because the Acadiana region of southwestern Louisiana was rich in oil and gas reserves due to the offshore drilling industry based there. As well, he let me know that the institution was trying to change its name from the University of Southwestern Louisiana to simply the University of Louisiana, and it was classified as a Carnegie II research institution. We talked for a couple of hours, and I told him that I would seriously consider it. But my heart, my soul, my mind was still set on the University of Arkansas. I wanted to be a Razorback. With no traction or luck, unfortunately, it just didn't materialize. In 1997, Steve Smith was teaching a course abroad during the summer at the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom. He invited me to attend this course and told me that the Clinton family had some really good connections at Oxford. So I did everything within my power financially to make sure that I was part of this. It was going to be a grand experience. In January 1997, Steve mailed me the required course readings for his seminar, and I immediately began reading the treatises. We were going to be studying the foundations of common law as it applied to free speech theory in the United Kingdom and the United States. This was classical high theory and very legalistic and philosophical in its approach. This would be my second international flight ever, and I would be leaving my son with my wife Brenda in Arkansas for 6 to 8 weeks. But I would basically be doing postgraduate studies with one of the world's disciplinary leaders in free speech theory and First Amendment law based at Oxford. This was my first cross-Atlantic flight, and I really wasn't prepared to go this long of a distance in flight. But I made it to Heathrow, boarded a bus in London, and traveled to Oxford. We were staying at St. Benet's Hall, which is where the seminar would be held. It was basically a Franciscan monastery with an active church and congregation. Not one of the high-end colleges at Oxford, mind you, but it had a good reputation for producing some very noteworthy scholars. At a place like Oxford University, you don't just have good students. You don't just have great students. Oxford gets their pick of the very best of the best worldwide. And I was lucky enough to have Steve behind me vouching for my credibility and intellectual work. I moved my 2 suitcases into my small dorm room, ordered my clothes and belongings in the drawers, and met the patron schoolmaster, the headmaster of St. Benet's Hall. His name was Father Henry, and he was a kind man and knew Steve personally. We talked for an hour about classical rhetoric, and he offered me a cigar. I gratefully accepted and began touring the university. Oxford has cobblestone streets throughout this very large campus. There are numerous bookstores, Oxford clothing stores, trinket shops, bed and breakfasts, and most importantly, bars. I remember Steve telling me that each one of the bars had a special story and was named after an important scholar or author. I went into one called The Bird and Child and ordered a pint of Strongbow hard cider. There were pictures of C.S. Lewis on the wall, and apparently this was C.S. Lewis's favorite bar. He used to come here to drink and write his masterpieces. So I drank my cider in awe and went on a red tour bus throughout the campus, looking at all the different facilities, getting a lecture. World-class museum after world-class museum. library upon library, research halls, college upon college, administrative buildings. This place was like nothing I'd ever before seen. I spent the next 3 days before Steve Smith arrived at our hall, St. Bennett's Hall, touring the campus, watching public hunt races, drinking ale, and generally getting oriented to the city campus. Our hall was right next door to the facility where penicillin was invented. These were not just smart people, these were intellectual giants. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely inferior and totally intimidated. How was I there? Obviously, it was more a matter of being connected than it was smart. Steve and the rest of the students finally arrived for the seminar, and we began classes with him immediately. The discussions were rich and filled with free-flowing ideas. We debated and talked and questioned one another. It was a magnificent experience. About a week into my trip, Steve Smith pulled me aside and notified me that the headmaster, Father Henry, had become impressed with my understanding of classical rhetoric during our first conversation. Then Steve told me that the headmaster had appointed me an official visiting scholar of the hall to be recorded in university documents. I was moved. I began crying. After all the hard work and all the late nights, I'd finally achieved something that was truly of importance to my heart, my soul, and probably my ego. Steve smiled. And then Steve reminded me that even though Bill Clinton attended Oxford University, he never graduated. I was honored. We carried on conversations during class, took oral examinations, had high table, and generally used the last week that we were there for touring the UK. One of my close friends there was Rene, who was from the Philippines, Manila specifically. She was the wife of a Filipino military general. She asked me if I would do her a favor. She said that she wanted to take the speed train, the bullet train, to Paris through the underwater tunnel, but did not want to go alone. So she asked me if I would accompany her and informed me that she would pay all of my expenses if I simply went with her. I was flat broke, but decided that it would be a pretty good idea to see Paris because I never knew when I would be back to Europe again. We took a taxi to the train station, boarded the bullet train, and made it to Paris in less than an hour and a half. In the UK, we got to see things like Shakespeare's Stratford upon Avon, the British Parliament, Big Ben, London Bridge, and even a Jack the Ripper exhibit. In Paris, we toured the Eiffel Tower, spent an entire day at the Louvre, visited all different types of museums, bought some clothing and perfume, and had fresh bread and chocolate crepes, washed down with Perrier seltzer water. As well, there was the Notre Dame Cathedral, the Arc de Triomphe, and while my wife and mother-in-law were at home watching my son in Arkansas, I was engaging in high-end academics and touring Europe. Not exactly fair to my wife, to be honest, but these are the horrible things that a scholar must do. I returned to Monticello about a week before classes began from the UK. I got my syllabi together, updated my CV, and continued building the online journal, the American Communication Journal, which had started to really become popular. And I was doing it with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Kuipers. Jim and I were co-editors of the journal. I handled the web design and he generally handled the content. One of our editorial board members was named Michael Calvin McGee, and Dr. McGee was based at the University of Iowa, home of the Hawkeyes. McGee and I started exchanging emails. I sent him a copy of my dissertation and he was generally impressed. He told me it was one of the most thorough dissertations that he had ever read. And this is high praise coming from someone at Iowa, which is considered to be the leading school in communication throughout the United States. Especially from a guy like McGee, who was also considered to be the kingpin of communication studies. We published a lot of articles, some of them really good and some of them mediocre, but McGee was always there to advise me and Jim on how we should structure the content to create something that was truly extraordinary and truly of substance. Meanwhile, while Jim was at Dartmouth College in Hanover, I was still stuck in Monticello, Arkansas. It was really starting to become an unbecoming situation, and it was really starting to become financially unbearable. I had a child now, and even though both my wife and I were working, we were barely making ends meet. Like I said before, teachers are not exactly compensated well. This is especially the case in the Southeast, and you better believe it in Arkansas. It's just a matter of fact. McGee sent me an invitation letter one day, offering a visiting professorship at the University of Iowa for a month. He said he wanted me to come to the campus and lecture to the graduate students on the topic of new communication technologies as it related to the communication discipline. He said it would be a paid gig and also informed me that he wanted me to apply for a new assistant professor position that was opening and that he was going to be the chair of the search committee. Finally, a chance. Steve was still trying to get me at the University of Arkansas. A friend of Steve's, known as Dr. Rita Kirk Willock at Southern Methodist University, asked me to apply for a position in Dallas. And Paul Bearfield down at the now University of Louisiana was also recruiting me. I even got an offer for an interview at San Jose State University in California that I eventually declined. My wife said that she would not go to California because it was going to break off the earth and fall into the ocean. She was serious. So our choices were SMU, Arkansas, Iowa, and Louisiana. I went to Iowa and did the visiting professorship, which was paid. SMU didn't work out. Arkansas didn't work out again, and we finally got an offer from the University of Louisiana. By now, my son was 1 year old, and we had been in Arkansas for a total of 5 years. So, if Louisiana was our only option, we were going to take it. I thank Steve for everything that he tried to do for me. I thanked Rita at SMU for everything she tried to do for me. I thanked McGee at Iowa for everything he tried to do for me. I sent a note of gratitude to San Jose State University, and we eventually conclusively signed the contract with the University of Louisiana, located in Lafayette, which is south central in the state, right on Interstate 10. The big public schools in the state were Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge and the University of Louisiana in Lafayette. The big private schools in the state were Tulane University and Loyola University in New Orleans. Even though I was not at the flagship school, which is LSU, the University of Louisiana recognized and supported research among its faculty. You see, UL had aspirations to become competitive within the state and the region, and my salary was instantly $20,000 a year better. I was right at about $49,000 to $50,000 a year, so it was a pretty good situation, and it was pretty much a no-brainer decision. We said our goodbyes in Arkansas to all of our close friends, resigned from our jobs, and gathered as many cardboard boxes as we could from Walmart. We packed our household goods, clothes, and furniture in a U-Haul pack van and vacated the premises. My mother-in-law was with us again, and I had the help of a student to drive the truck. Everyone in Arkansas was sad to see us go, but they promised to visit us in Louisiana. Our house was clear, my office was clear, Brenda's classroom was clear, my mother-in-law was taking care of my son, and we started driving south. Given the horrible situation that Monticello had become professionally, I was truly looking forward to experiencing my new assistant professor line at the University of Louisiana. Upon arrival, we moved all of our things and furniture into the new 2-bedroom apartment. Then we all went out for dinner. Crawfish, shrimp, oysters, crabs, you name it. This was French Louisiana, home of the Ragin' Cajuns. We had finally arrived at a decent institution, or so I thought. Chapter 5, Future Shock. Medellin and ayahuasca. The date is now January the 4th, 2021, in the middle of a global pandemic. Some 20 years into the future timeline of these memoirs, and I have just arrived in Atlanta, Georgia, once again, after visiting Medellin, Colombia for the 3rd time in my life. This time, I spent an entire month getting used to the valley and met interesting people who might have potential business interests that run deep in Colombia. All kinds of business, really. Of course, there was another reason for me going to Colombia this time. After doing some due diligence and research online, I discovered that there was an ayahuasca retreat located in Rio Negro, which is right next to the international airport in Medellin. If you don't know what ayahuasca is, you should do a little personal online digging and research. It is the ancient mixture of some very special sacred plant roots from the Amazon, combined with a particular type of tree bark that creates a hypnotic and psychedelic drink that, once consumed, induces vomiting and what are perceived to be highly spiritual, hypnotic visions and sometimes life-changing decisions over the course of 4 to 6 hours. This is not an experience to be taken lightly or as a mere joke. You are essentially chemically resetting the cerebral cortex through the pineal gland with a showering of pure DMT. Psychologists and psychiatrists call this the big reset because you are pouring the principal ingredient for spiritual hyperactivity directly into the mental socket for out-of-body experiences. Ayahuasca has been around for almost 9,000 years, according to ancient hieroglyphs, and Western medicine has only been operational under the rationality scientific paradigm for about 400 to 500 years. Little is known by Western science about these properties or their effects because USA President Richard Nixon categorized psychedelics as a Schedule I narcotic that had no redeeming medical value in 1969. The drink mixture has highly psychoactive property that includes sacred moving geometry patterns presented in the mind of the patient. To properly do this medicine from the Amazon, it is required that you do a purging over a 4-day period to cleanse your body and mind of all the impurities that still toxify your organism. My retreat was for 5 days, and I prepared by drinking lots of water and eating light foods while being forced to vomit repeatedly through the application of tree frog skin scrapings called a Kimbo purge to intradermal punk stick burns on the back of my neck. The retreat that I signed up for provided 4 overall ayahuasca sessions. Each session was unique and each experience was profoundly different and rather breathtaking. Some people are known to do extremely radical and life-changing things after experiencing ayahuasca. Some people sell all of their life belongings and move to a remote destination somewhere else in the world. Some people's marriages are cleansed and rekindled. And yes, even some divorces occur as a result of the visions and prophecies derived from the ayahuasca experience. As a psychoactive property, people should definitely know what they're getting into. The indigenous Amazon people consider ayahuasca to be serious medicine and not to be taken recreationally for mere shits and giggles. This is considered ancient spiritual healing brought by their ancestors in their perspective. My first day of the retreat was spent getting to know the family, staff, and other patients. We generally joked around and talked about what we might be experiencing later that night. As the sun set that evening, an independent musician was playing Hare Krishna music to set the stage, and we all gathered around the shaman for his speech about the beauty, elegance, and supernatural simplicity of the ayahuasca experience. We were all nervous. Could we die? What were we to expect? Then my turn came, and among a fog of palm smoke, Hare Krishna music, and bells and whistles, I drank my first cup of ayahuasca. It tasted a lot like moldy prune juice and was a little bit viscous, but hey, I swallowed it. For the next hour to an hour and a half, I laid on my back and stared at the stars across the moonless sky. In the background, soft guitar and peaceful Krishna music. Of course, I vomited several times, which was to be expected, but the shaman was good enough to wipe my face with a wet cloth, and we all huddled around the campfire for the show to begin. Then suddenly, a pack of wild dogs came up to the campfire and started licking my face. And then I thought to myself, what in the hell have I gotten into? But they were not a hallucination or a vision from the ayahuasca. They were actual dogs that the shaman simply shooed away. Then I started laughing, giggling. And then the patterns started presenting in my eyes. Ancient Masonic rite symbolism, pyramids, triangular geometry arranged in highly symbolic and systematic sequences. Individual notes coming from the music started taking visual form with interlaced colors and free-flowing visual significance. Old photographs that I had taken and were somehow still stored visually in my mind started presenting themselves on a psychological reel for my personal review. Raw emotions, feelings, shame, ridicule, embarrassment, trauma, everything that I've experienced in life started popping up in my mind, seeking resolve and detente. My now deceased mother and I spoke, and we communicated our undying support and love for each other. I knew that she was in a better place. My grandfather, who died of lung cancer, and I embraced, and in my mind, I was at peace with their passing. The ease and simplicity of knowing that my loved ones were okay in the other world was priceless. The true love and joy of being able to communicate with someone, even if they are a vision remnant in a dormant psyche, is something that I personally cherish and recommend to everyone listening to this. If you'll only get and take the opportunity to experience something that is outside of the understanding of Western culture and experience. My second day drinking ayahuasca was a bit more prophetic because it dealt more specifically with my experience in the CIA. After weaving inside and outside of security checkpoints throughout some 32 countries in the world over the last decade, I had a lot of unanswered questions and personal issues that involved trust and loyalty. Not only had I been interviewed on Russia Today television about the Trump doctrine developing in the Middle East, but that particular live interview broadcast throughout the Middle East went viral online in Arabic with over 80 million views. I was in a completely new realm, a personal experience with the world's intelligence agencies, because I was now on public record as having worked with the agency. After the visual shower of pyramids, octagons, and three-dimensional geography pushed their way through my psyche, I found myself in a dark room that had been completely blacked out of all light. There were exactly 6 men in the room, with me making 7. All of them had stars distributed throughout their body, and their hearts were shooting out flares of lightning. The 6 men gathered around a table. All of them were chanting and praying in different languages and tongues. However, all of them were bowing in the same motion to a rising pyramid with a gold tip that glowed. "Join us," they whispered. Then I witnessed my own death. I was gasping for air. I was sweating. My heart was racing. And then I had my first out-of-body experience on ayahuasca. I was hovering over myself in the hospital. There were oxygen tubes distributed throughout my face and tubes in my body, and the heartbeat monitor flatlined. People who have experienced this before during ayahuasca ceremonies refer to it as Mother Ayahuasca's ego death, where you experience your own loss of life while still holding consciousness. After I had passed away, I then felt pure love and joy from the universe. There was a rush of light throughout my eyes. It was such a warm, pure feeling. I felt connected to God and in sync with the will of the supernatural. The rest of that night was spent talking to the campfire, holding a conversation with the flames, reaching an understanding that my purpose on this planet had not yet been fully resolved or fully understood by myself. However, on the third night, I experienced something directly out of an erotic film festival that had somehow been personally engineered for my sexual psyche. After drinking the ayahuasca, I went through the normal vomiting and purging of impurities, but I also experienced a rather stiff erection. It was massive and throbbing. Then I had the most beautiful, sexy, exotic, young, Latina female with black flowing hair and big, beautiful brown eyes walk up to me in the mist. She was putting on Corvette red lipstick and makeup and asked me devilishly if I wanted to have sex with her. Then she took out a fat Colombian blunt made out of marijuana and lit it up and began smoking in a very seductive and persuasive manner. She would suck and sexily blow in my general direction. She asked me if I liked it when she smoked for me. I said yes, very much. Then she handed me the blunt and blew a stream of smoke directly into my face. We started kissing. We started taking off our clothes. And then she mounted me from the top while smoking the blunt, and we had passionate, animalistic sexual intercourse. After we were finished, she asked me if I'd enjoyed myself. I said yes, a great deal. She told me that I needed to enjoy myself much more in life. And then she slowly disappeared into the wind with a grin on her face. Then the vomiting started again, and I fell asleep by the campfire and woke up the next morning with an old white cat laying beside me. The fourth ayahuasca experience occurred without any vomiting. Apparently, my body had gotten used to the substance, and my trance state became much more quickly involved, like within 40 minutes. And then suddenly my mind transported me to Phoenix City, Alabama, in a Waffle House restaurant. I was having eggs, bacon, hash browns, and grits. It seemed like a normal day. Then my grandmother Adams walked into the diner and sat down at my booth with me. She told me that she was very proud of me for all the hard work and dedication that I'd put into my career and family. She told me she was proud of how I handled all of the changes in my life over the last decade. But she also told me that I needed to learn how to be more flexible with the people I deal with. She drank her coffee and I drank mine. And she told me very directly that my life had significance and that I shouldn't consider suicide anymore and that God was not through with me yet. She said that sometimes God breaks men into little pieces and shatters their lives in preparation to test and increase their faith. She assured me that she understood all of my pain and suffering, especially about the divorce, but promised me that there would be a day of reckoning for those who had sabotaged my life. I paid the bill. We walked outside and said goodbye. At that time, I took a second dose of ayahuasca and passed out completely unconsciously by the campfire. I don't remember anything else, except that the next morning at the retreat, we had oatmeal and guava juice while drinking large amounts of water to rehydrate and replenish the gut. On that last day of the retreat, I walked around the peaceful ranch looking at the animals. I thought about my experiences and wondered about their symbolic importance in the future trajectory of my life. Then I showered, packed my bags, and took the taxi from the plateau down into the Medellin Valley proper. I went to my Airbnb apartment and slept for 2 days straight. Upon the next morning, I had fruit for breakfast with fresh Colombian coffee. I thought I would take my fantasy girl's advice and go on the prowl that afternoon for some action. The particular place you go in Medellin for some female companionship is known as Veracruz Avenue. For a 3 to 4 block area, the entire walkways, sidewalks, and small bars have working girls in them. And in Colombia, the price for sex with a working girl is about the equivalent of 12 United States dollars. And ever since Venezuela went extremely to the left and adopted Hugo Chavez's vision of a socialist Venezuela, Venezuelans have been trying to escape the country because it was deteriorating and basically collapsing. And they did this by any means necessary. So here in nearby Colombia, you'll see a lot of homeless Venezuelan prostitutes who literally live and survive on the sex trade. There's no pimp, there's no boss. They are all independent working girls angling for a quick buck and the opportunity to meet someone who may potentially change their lives. In the USA, this is called prostitution. In Colombia, this is called dating. There's a lot of things in Colombia that are legal, which are clearly and specifically illegal in the United States. Well, for starters, prostitution in the United States is a misdemeanor and can get you some serious jail time. In Colombia, it is considered a normal working profession for both men and women, and there exists no laws or legislation making it illegal. In the United States, even though times are a-changin', marijuana is still considered a controlled substance and is treating accordingly from both federal and state governments. In Colombia, not only does no one ever get arrested for carrying marijuana, it is most often consumed on the streets in public view where everyone can smell and see. In the United States, Possession of cocaine is a straight-up felony and will certainly get you stiff jail sentence if you are caught in violation of the law. In Colombia, the government itself is moving to nationalize the production and distribution networks on behalf of the state, thereby legalizing the substance. You have to remember, a large portion of Colombia's population consumes cocaine, and it is considered as regular, as normal, as ordinary a part of life as simple coffee. To the Colombians, it's a national commodity that has the potential to generate ample revenue that is sorely needed. And of course, Colombia bears the scars of decades-long history violence between warring cartels. So there I was on Veracruz prowling around. I got a beer and lit a cigarette, had a seat. Then I started walking around, gazing around my surroundings. There were hot, beautiful, young Latina women absolutely everywhere, and it was driving me out of my mind. One thing you need to know about me, I am consistent when it comes to my sexual tastes. Curvy, young, beautiful, hot little Latina women, particularly those who smoke weed. That's my thing. That's what trips my trigger. I don't know why, that's just how I'm engineered. And here, in this region of Colombia, Antioquia, the entire menu looked good. I walked slowly on Veracruz Avenue, smiling at the young women who were selling their wares, seeing if there was a connection or some hint of personal chemistry. I walked for about an hour, and nothing really seemed to excite me. And then I went into a bar called the Hilton Grill. It was a middle-class strip club, and a young woman named Luisa walked up to me and introduced herself. We sat down and drank several rounds of beer, and she mentioned that she really didn't like to drink so much. So, naturally, I pulled a big fat joint out of my pocket and asked her if she smoked marijuana. She laughed. She smiled. And then she said, "Oh, definitely yes." So we went outside on the street and smoked out. And then she asked me if I liked cocaine. I told her that I have never tried cocaine and had no intention of trying it, so no. Then she took out a little packet with cocaine in it, looked at me and said, "Respeta," and did a small bump on the back of her wrist, snorting it with a smile. She then told me if I ever wanted to try it with her, she would teach me how and make sure that I got the best top quality product in Medellin. I was curious. I asked her how much a simple gram of pure cocaine cost. She told me about $1. The last I heard, cocaine was going for about $150 a gram in the United States. That's literally 150 times your money off original supply in Colombia. I wondered who was making all this money. I was wondering what was being purchased and financed with this money. And then it occurred to me, organized crime had moved into the supply chain and was capturing ridiculous, obscene amounts of profits off the international sale, trade, and commerce surrounding the cocaine industry in Colombia. That's also the case for Peru and probably even Ecuador. A majority of the economic sector, which deals in the international trade, is focused on capturing these profits. And it is just plain business. To them, they're not doing anything illegal. And mostly, all of the legitimate businesses that operate in these countries are somehow drawing profits and being supported and funded and financed by the black cocaine economy. Money simply goes around from station to station. And of course, this kind of profitability, 150 times your money, is heavily sought after in the black trade of intelligence because the money, the proceeds, are untraceable cash dollars in very large bulk supply. And these dollars do a lot of good and bad. Even in the digital world, cash is king. And for the Colombians who see cocaine as a normal part of their day, and moreover, a normal part of their existence, it simply does not carry the demonization that it does from the United States or Canada. To us in the North, these are highly illicit substances which are to be controlled by law enforcement officials. To them, the abundant supply and regularized use make the drug ordinary. It's just life, and cocaine is part of it, as normal as rice and gravy in Louisiana. And we in the USA, at 150 times your money, we are the targets of their international sales force. Please remember that my dissertation was on the topic of narco-terrorism in Peru. I had fully and completely studied how the insurgency's shining path was so effective in turning Peruvian cocaine into cash sales, and thereby purchasing weapons, mostly from the Soviets, to fuel their insurgency and revolt. Obviously, the same kind of thing was going on in Colombia. However, this time, in this case, in this place, it was not a cartel that was in charge, it was the actual government. According to the newspapers in Colombia, the government was considering legalizing cocaine completely and nationalizing the trade through proper government oversight and management. Since I had been in Colombia, I had witnessed several parties where cocaine was free-flowing and being openly and publicly consumed by all of the revelers. Obviously, I had to know more. I couldn't just stop at this. I had to see the operations. I had to move up the food chain from the consumers to the suppliers. And luckily, my new friend, Luisa, kindly told me that she would introduce me to someone on New Year's Eve. At 6 o'clock that evening, her taxi picked me up and we went into the mountainous regions of Colombia overlooking the valley. Our taxi was greeted at the end of the dark road by two gunmen wielding shotguns and flashlights. Luisa told them who she was and that she had an appointment with El Padre. They led us through the checkpoint and we drove up to a simple ranch house. It was about to get interesting, and I was about to get the education of my life. El Padre walked outside with his bodyguards. There were about 5 to 6 bodyguards in total, all of which were armed heavily. I got out of the taxi and walked alongside Luisa to El Padre and shook his hand. I spoke in my 5th grade Spanish and let him know that it was a pleasure to meet him and that I had some buyers for his product. He asked me if I wanted to try cocaine with him to understand the purity of the product. And I said no, that I didn't consume cocaine and wouldn't understand in any circumstance. All I did was smoke good Colombian marijuana. We walked inside the casita and he poured me a cup of coffee. He asked me if I had cash buyers with their own transportation, and I told him yes. He asked me if I wanted to see the supply. I said yes. We drank coffee, chatted, and then he invited me for a quick ride in the truck. We went down a dark road and pulled up to an apartment building. He told me that the apartment building was his personal warehouse for the product. And then we went up to the 2nd floor, walked down the hall, and he unlocked a door to the very first apartment. When the door opened, I saw stacks and stacks of cocaine white bricks throughout the entire apartment. They were stacked to the ceiling, literally. I asked the Padre how much it cost for a kilo of the purest product he had available, and he replied about $1,000 US. Now, understand me. I know I'm no mathematician, okay? But if you could purchase something for $1,000 a kilogram in one place, which just so happens to be Colombia, and you can sell that very same kilogram in another place for $150,000, would you risk it? That's the question that I kept asking myself, around and around in my mind, over and over. And you have to think about the situation I'm personally looking at and realize that I have the means, motive, and opportunity to commit an international crime. With all of my worldly contacts, my contacts in the Middle East, should I go from white to black and join the professional criminal class? At 52 years of age, with no 401k retirement plan or family assets to speak of, you do a real gut check. El Padre gave Luisa a complimentary gram of cocaine, and we walked back to the truck cab, where she placed it on her cell phone glass and snorted it. Then we went back to our taxi, drove back to the city, had a very nice steak dinner, and went back to my apartment. I pulled out a big fat marijuana blunt, and we smoked and talked and made love. It was an extremely sensual experience being with Luisa, and I looked forward to someday retiring in Colombia because these people understand what the word freedom means. Everyone is left to their own devices, and you are personally responsible for yourself. And it's something that you need to personally manage. You take care of it yourself. Massive poverty, total depredation of economy. But everyone is actively hawking in the market backed by cocaine. So what's your price? What's your price? At what point in your life do your financial problems that cannot be resolved through a normal 9-to-5-a-day job cry out for an outside-of-the-box solution like this? For the next week, I spent as much time as I could with Luisa, bonding and building a relationship, looking at all of the markets and proud people. We drank, we ate, we even danced rumba, and I knew I was home. Even though this city is rather dangerous from time to time, if you keep your head and your wits about you, you'll be absolutely fine. Meanwhile, the ayahuasca was still unfolding chemically in my mind, as there are some very real and serious after effects of being dosed with a medication. My dreams were vivid and surreal, and the most simple thing could have profound meaning and symbolism. It was as if I had crossed the path from being a language-using animal into the territory of being a symbol-using animal. After all, symbolism is the most pure form of an international and cross-cultural language for all of humanity in the world. So I started paying particular attention to the symbols that crossed my path. Luisa told me that she had a surprise for me and wanted to take me to the airport to return to the United States. So she swung by in a taxi, picked up my bag, and we made the 30-minute trek up the hillside to the international airport. We got out of the taxi, and she kissed me. While lifting up her right sleeve on her blouse, she showed me my name literally tattooed on her right breast. I was floored and a little bit honored. Then I flew back home. At the writing of these memoirs, I am at 1905 10th Avenue in Phoenix City, Alabama. My dad had a meeting with a probate judge here in town who was contacted by the CIA and FBI requesting that I, once again, be committed to a mental asylum. My dad explained that I was his caretaker and that he was my caretaker. And at 84 years old, after my mother's passing 2 years ago, my father's emotional and mental health has not really been in good shape. Even though I am supposed to have delusions myself, The onset of dementia in my father's brain has started to show very real signs, and his bodily and psychological control is not what it used to be. So, for the moment, we live in a very precarious and dangerous balance where I have to take care of him and he has to take care of me. With that said, the CIA and FBI really could give a shit about personal family matters such as this when they want something, especially when a presidential election is going on, and especially when Donald Trump has essentially fomented a third party developing in the United States, which is not content on the status quo. Anyway, beyond all that, I promised my father that I would reside with him until his passing. I just couldn't see putting him into a nursing home, and frankly, I'm somewhat financially dependent upon him. Chapter 6. Peace, Love, and Crawfish. Louisiana is known for a lot of interesting and strange things. Cajuns, Creoles, crabs, crawfish, colossal shrimp, bizarre backwoods politics, fresh oysters, microbreweries, deer hunting, gumbo, sport fishing, swamps, and yes, even raunchy Bourbon Street in New Orleans. The mighty Mississippi River cuts directly through the state, dividing Baton Rouge and Lafayette with the notorious Atchafalaya Basin. New Orleans is home to the Superdome, some of the most outrageous strip clubs in the world, and debauchery at almost every single turn. Some of the best restaurants in the world can also be found in Louisiana. True, authentic Cajun food is considered a delicacy among people throughout the planet. There happen to be 4 major institutions in the state: Louisiana State University, located in Baton Rouge, home of the Tigers, and it is considered the flagship public institution. Tulane University in New Orleans is also considered very influential, and the elite well-to-do usually go there. Loyola University in New Orleans is also a top-notch private institution, and the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, the home of the mighty Ragin' Cajuns, is also an influential public institution of note and significance. My wife Brenda and my son relocated with me to Lafayette in the summer of 1998. Lafayette was a town of considerable size. It was not a major metropolis, but it also did not represent small-town America like Monticello, Arkansas did. Throughout the city, there were shopping centers, fast food chains, apartment complexes, housing developments, a major mall, and gourmet restaurants of every shape and size. The culture in Louisiana, if you're not aware, is largely built around food. The Cajun cuisine takes some getting used to, but people come from all over the planet to sample the food in this region known as French Louisiana. Interestingly, the history of the region is just as rich as the food. The Cajun settlers who came to the Acadiana region were castaways from Canada. As the story goes, the British were hunting the French down in Canada and drove out a large segment of the French population who fled southward down the Mississippi River until they got to Louisiana, and they stayed put. In this region, you will find many natives who still speak Cajun French. In the customs and the culture, you will also find French influence in the art, language, traditions, music, namesakes of the people, and the overall joy of life. Frankly, Cajuns happen to be some of the happiest people on the planet. Our new apartment was modest. Our furniture was reasonable. Our rent was manageable. The population of the University of Louisiana was considered to be about 17,000 students. And even though the university did not have a law school or a medical program, they did have several PhD programs in selected disciplines, which made the university a powerhouse Carnegie 2A doctoral granting institution. Dr. Paul Bearfield was my immediate supervisor, and his official title was full professor and department chair. My job, well, I was a brand new assistant professor of communication with 2 years of credit toward my tenure clock. If you don't know, American universities typically give you 6 years after your PhD awarding before you are reviewed for tenure and promotion. If you are successful with tenure and promotion, you are offered a lifetime contract and promoted to the rank of associate professor. So the pressure is really on during the 6-year clock to perform well in your teaching, research, and service to the university so that the institution will, in turn, offer you the so-called armor of tenure. Tenure is supposed to protect you from institutional politics. In theory, that is. Faculty members with tenure usually have a strong voice on campus and celebrate their free speech wholeheartedly because the institution is basically prevented from disciplining them for the things that they say. That's why tenure is considered the gold coin of being a professor. So there we were. Finally, we had arrived at a significant research institution. The question was, how would all of this play out now? I was at a brand new institution with a brand new set of colleagues and rules, and I had been identified by my department chair as the computer and technology wizard of the department. You'll have to remember that I was still the editor for the American Communication Journal Online, which was a web-based serial of the American Communication Association. Everything that I did in my spare time revolved around advancing this journal property. And I had a team of about 30 to 40 influential scholars backing me as associate editors on this project. You also need to remember that it was 1998, and the World Wide Web was still in its beginning. The web had not become a popular medium for the distribution of information yet. And we were all worried about the year Y2K when computers were not supposed to recognize a 4-digit year and would perceive the date to be 00 instead of 2000. There were no smartphones, Google was just starting to emerge online, and the conspiracy theories around a total meltdown of information infrastructures because of Y2K was running rampant, with businesses and organizations throwing considerable money into a frenzied reprogramming of their computers in order that they be able to recognize year 2000 onward. From 1998 to the year 2000, I spent much of my time consulting for companies in the region, mainly oil and gas companies, building websites for their organization and coaching programmers how to deal with Y2K. The money flow was pretty good, and we were loving Southwest Louisiana and crawfish. Aye! The first year in Louisiana was very good. Brenda and I celebrated Louisiana life and culture and fully experienced the smorgasbord of different food that was now available to us. Our favorite dish was boiled crawfish, seasoned in a mixture of Cajun salt and spices that would make your lips and mouth delightfully burn red hot. But whatever you do, if you're eating this stuff, don't put your fingers in your eyes. It'll burn horribly. There's nothing quite as satisfying and empowering socially as bellowing up to a newspaper-coated table with about 10 to 15 of your friends, drinking keg draft beer and devouring 200 pounds of heavily seasoned crawfish. We learned the art and science of peeling crawfish, Louisiana style, and were even taught how to properly suck the heads for the fat deposit located in the carcass. While we were renting an apartment in Lafayette, I was busy at the university getting my personal library and office together. The university was good enough to buy me a brand new Pentium computer with all of the bells and whistles necessary to build a rich multimedia experience for my editorship with the American Communication Journal Online. The faculty even welcomed me with a surprise shrimp boil, and the welcome mat had been laid out properly. I searched through the university warehouse for spare furniture for my office and selected the things that I thought would work well in the room. Burke Hawthorne Hall at the University of Louisiana is the home of the communication department, and it's right outside of the city. Outside the office was Cypress Lake, which is a small pond filled with alligators and goldfish. This was what is called a mid-major school, where all of the sports teams play Division I schedules, but the institution is second tier and not considered the flagship of the state. However, it was a gargantuan leap from the University of Arkansas at Monticello out in the cow pastures. Dr. Bearfield gave me my teaching schedule, and I prepared my syllabuses with exactitude and precision. So there we were, fall of 1998, and I was ready to rock. Our online journal was gaining notoriety throughout the academic enterprise, and I was becoming a very popular person among the higher ranks of academe due to my presence online. It was a good time, and my wife Brenda had secured a kindergarten teaching position in Lafayette. We were both employed, my son was in daycare, and our mother-in-law constantly visited us because she enjoyed the food and the Catholic religion. Catholicism runs very, very deep in French Louisiana. The other faculty that we had assembled in the communication department were pretty high quality and noteworthy too. We had Dr. Bill Davey in mass communication broadcasting, who had his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. We also had Dr. Michael Mayer from the University of Texas at Austin, who was known for his public relations studies on information campaigns and environmental settings. And we also had Dr. Janet Bridges, who came from Michigan State University and was a quantitative statistical hound that studied differences in gender communication. Most of the faculty were well known throughout the discipline of communication. It was a quality B-plus school with a quality B-plus faculty, which now included me. During our first year in Lafayette, Brenda and I spent a lot of time in the afternoons, evenings, and weekends looking at the real estate market in Lafayette, dreaming that maybe someday we could buy a home. Our salaries, however, were no match for the real estate market. Because of the high-paying salaries for petroleum engineers and other oil and gas staff, we came to the realization that while we were being well compensated compared to Monticello, Arkansas, we had fallen into yet another economic trap. There was no way that we could save money for a down payment on a new home, and we were at the point of trying to put down some roots and start a family. It was time to get more serious about work. It was time to get more serious about income, and it was time to get more serious about earning this tenure and promotion armor at the University of Louisiana. These were good times, but they were also very serious times. My close personal friend, Michael Calvin McGee at the University of Iowa, said that he was sorry that I didn't come to Iowa, but wished me well in Louisiana. Steve Smith up at the University of Arkansas and I continued talking on an hourly basis, and we engineered, promoted, and marketed the American Communication Journal Online to become the premier hot property for communication research. As a result, during this time, the American Communication Association membership surpassed 5,000 people online. With a little bit of disruptive thinking, we had successfully transitioned a completely made-up, worthless name into a thriving, breathing, actual intellectual property online, which people would work tirelessly to be involved with. And from 1998 to 2000, the journal grew in stature and impact throughout academia, while the World Wide Web and Internet continued to march forward, exploding multimedia properties throughout the online arena, radically transforming news, entertainment, information gathering, even library science, and just about anything and everything that relied upon information from paper to a new form of something called computer-mediated communication. And there I was, well positioned as the university's expert on the internet. In fact, Wadsworth Publishers sought me out to write the definitive book on the internet and all of its communication tools for its textbook publishing group. My first year at the university was spent getting the journal ready for quarterly publication by completing my textbook contract with Wadsworth, hopefully, which might have the potential to generate enough income so that we could put a down payment on a house. With my mother-in-law visiting us so regularly, we had a lot of help in the house with watching my son. So Brenda and I decided that we would dedicate more time toward our professional careers. One day, while we were riding around Youngsville, Louisiana, in the green minivan, we came across a neighborhood known as Copperfield. This neighborhood had community tennis courts, a children's park, a wonderful swimming pool, and there were even decorated gardens and park benches distributed throughout the entire neighborhood. We dreamed we could get a house there. Then we saw a 4-bedroom, 2-bath house on Copperfield Drive, and believe it or not, the price was affordable. My mother-in-law promised us $10,000 as a down deposit for the home, and we made an offer on the house for $142,000, which was accepted by the seller. We were so excited. It was our very first home, and finally, after years and years of late nights and hard work and dedication, we had secured the home we'd always dreamed of in a neighborhood and area that was quite respectable. And of course, there was Louisiana's food. We bought the house, signed the mortgage, moved into the house, and began our second year in Louisiana. Times were good. With work and home efforts combined, I was spending anywhere between 16 to 18 hours a day online. Not that this is unusual for an academic, mind you. However, new websites and new coding techniques were coming out on a daily basis. You could say that I had entered kind of a mental fugue, or some sort of version of digital delirium, because whenever I was away from the computer, I would see imprints and patterns in my mind of raw computer code, JavaScript, HTML, cascading style sheets, and then came the inventions online. Amazon, Dell, Yahoo, Google, America Online. My seriousness about my profession had worked me into a locked state of digital frenzy, and I slowly started breaking away from actual reality with all of my virtual online habits. My thinking, my rationality started taking on a different perspective and perception altogether. And with the work I was doing on the textbook, I was completely maxed out on my publication schedule and agenda. It wasn't for a lack of effort, that's for sure. I put my all into this job. But the tsunami of digital information, the wave of crunching computer info that we were all experiencing had everyone shocked, stunned, and a little confused. This was a new medium developing in communication right before our eyes, and it was literally reinventing itself every single day with new developments and new online products. I was sitting in the catbird seat professionally, because whenever somebody thought of the web and computer-mediated communication, naturally, they thought of me. During the second year in Louisiana, Jim Kuipers up at Dartmouth College and I kept pushing the journal forward. The website had close to 600,000 hits on it, and it had become a hotly discussed topic at conventions, conferences, and even right there in my shop among my faculty. We were getting all types of submissions for peer review, and there was no shortage of content to referee for publication. Then one day, I got a phone call from my old professor at the University of Florida named Dr. Lynn Webb. Lynn was one of the peer reviewers for our journal, and she had somehow successfully secured full professor position at the University of Arkansas, right alongside Stephen A. Smith, Bill Clinton's best friend. Steve told me that it was because her husband had been hired dean of the law school at the University of Arkansas, and they had to find her a trailing spouse position at the university. Steve also told me to be extremely careful with her because her ethics were not always in alignment with her political actions. I wish I would have listened to him in hindsight, because he was absolutely 100% right. She was a meddling and vicious woman who only sought to advance her own cause and did not believe in the concept of friendship or utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. Anyway, I made the mistake and trusted her. She told me about a colleague of hers that was one publication short of tenure and promotion at the University of Arkansas and asked me if we could do a quick turnaround review of one of her research articles. She told me how stressed out this person was and that she would consider it a personal favor if we tried to help her because she might lose her job and she had children. Naturally, I felt empathy toward this person, even if I didn't know them, and if I could somehow help, I would be more than willing to do so. I received the article, sent it to Dr. Kuipers for review, and promptly forgot about it. 3 weeks later, Dr. Kuipers told me that the article had been rejected on a 1-2 decision. This was not good news for my friend, and this was not good news for Dr. Webb. So I read the research article, and while it was very simplistic in its design, it had some meaningful conclusions, and I told Jim that we were going to publish the article anyway based upon my personal review of the research. He argued with me. He chided me. He scolded me. He called the article shit and said that I was breaking and bending the rules for a friend trying to curry favor with Lynn Webb, which I kind of was. Anyway, I held firm on the decision to publish the article, to which Jim responded by resigning from the journal publicly on our listserv. Everyone connected to the journal could read Jim's comments and ethics accusations, citing me for a breach of propriety. And then, for the first time ever, my world completely caved in. All sorts of communication, comments from all sorts of people, from all ranks and states started attacking me online. There were emails calling me names, citing the breach of trust, and even dereliction of duty that I had exhibited by fudging the review process. Dr. Webb saw this, called me, and screamed at me like a bitch. Even though she told me on the phone to publish her friend's essay, it was my fault. I started getting headaches. I was manic, and this lasted for a 3 to 4 week period of time, during which my hands would shake uncontrollably on the mouse to the point where I could not operate a simple computer. Dr. Webb's advice was for me to just remain completely silent and say nothing to the allegations or charges being levied against me. She told me not to dignify the response. She also told me that she would publicly defend me, which she tried to do but was not effective at doing. But that's only because she was connected to me in the so-called crime. Michael Calvin McGee, my alleged friend at the University of Iowa, assumed the role of prosecutor, and he was vicious and rhetorically violent with me. He kept asking me how I could possibly still be employed anymore, given my clear breach of ethics. He called for my resignation at work. I remained quiet, and then Steve Smith moved into the conversation with the backing, silently and ambiguously, of the executive of the United States and let everyone see just how power operates in organizational politics. In the end, after all the harassment, Jim and I were both reinstated as editors of the journal, and we finished our term. But the scandal, the outpouring of abuse, had done its psychological damage to me personally. I was embarrassed, ashamed, ridiculed, and publicly tarred and feathered among the very people I had been working for, trying to please, over the past 3 years. When I would walk down the halls of my house, the sheetrock of the walls would bend inward to my eyes. My anxiety, depression started becoming delusional thinking, and it kicked into a psychosis where I would cry at the drop of a hat. It was a lot like the Student Government Association politics at the University of Florida, way back when. I was sick but didn't realize it. I'd been humiliated by my own so-called friends once again. Around that time, during Mardi Gras 2000, after Y2K had come and gone with no major event, I was contacted by Dr. Rita Kirk Willock of Southern Methodist University. She asked me if I wanted to upgrade institutions again and come to SMU. She said she was recruiting me. Apparently, my new textbook and the journal had made me a commodity for a true Division I research institution. And even though we had just purchased a new home in Youngsville, Louisiana, I entertained the recruitment by SMU. We talked several times, and the salary was easily $10,000 a year higher than Louisiana. Not to mention the fact that my wife's salary would be $10,000 a year higher too, simply by moving out of the dilapidated state of Louisiana, which is a horrible place for academics. So I went on the interview and impressed the faculty at SMU and got a formal offer to be an assistant professor. After arguing with Brenda for several days about a possible relocation to Dallas, I unilaterally made the decision that we would be moving to Dallas whether she liked it or not. Brenda was not pleased. She loved her new home and had started to make friends in Louisiana. But this was the gold ring. You don't get much better than SMU in terms of academic respect and reputation. So I signed the contract offer and we put our new house up for sale. SMU paid for a moving company to gather our belongings and furniture and deliver them to Dallas. Paul Bearfield at Louisiana, who had been a fan and supporter of mine for quite some time, wished us luck and told me that if things didn't work out and I ever wanted to return to Louisiana, that he trusted me and valued my work ethic and we could come back. I hugged him, I kissed him on the cheek, and then we relocated to Dallas. We were going to be SMU Mustangs now. The university was building a new football stadium. The buildings were all modern and pristine. The gardens at SMU and grounds were rich and green and lush. And this was not just a top university. It was a world-class institution. I could certainly make a name for myself throughout the country here in Dallas. My career couldn't be going any better, professionally speaking, but the psychological damage that McGee, Stephanie Koopman, Lynn Webb, and Jim Kuipers had done to me in my mind, my psyche, my emotional state had been done. I was locked in paranoia mode. I started wondering who was out to get me next, and it was a straight-up psychological loop where I would experience harsh critical rhetoric, and it turned me into a frenzied mess. Not only that, Jim Kuipers had taught me a definite personal lesson. Be careful who you trust. I wasn't sleeping well, and a lot of direct damage had been done to my reputation. I was manic, smoking again, and at times, randomly, I would simply break down and cry. But there we were, driving from Lafayette to Dallas to start a new adventure. Dallas is the birthplace of fajitas and margaritas. So we loaded up on SMU memorabilia and traded our Ragin' Cajun gear to become Mustangs. We signed a loan for the construction of a new home in Grapevine, Texas. My mother-in-law came to us in Dallas to watch my son, and we set up our new offices and classrooms in preparation for the next school year. I had secured some summer teaching from SMU, so in June 2000, I made myself comfortable in my new office and began teaching. But psychologically, I was shot. I was still on the edge after realizing how close I came to being fired in Louisiana without the prospect